Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into the crumbling stone corridors of medieval Europe, where magnificent castles that once dominated skylines now stand as haunting ruins against twilight skies. You can almost hear the whispers of ancient stones telling stories of glory turned to decay, of mighty fortresses that fell not to enemy armies, but to the relentless march of time itself. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why these architectural marvels that survived centuries of warfare ultimately surrendered to forces far more subtle yet devastating. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to share where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps offer a kind word about the journey we're about to take together through medieval history's most fascinating decline. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the year 1066, watching Norman masons lay the first stones of what will become England's greatest fortress network. The conquest has just concluded, and William's architects are already sketching plans that will reshape an entire continent's skyline. You witness the birth of an architectural revolution that transforms Europe from a landscape of wooden palisades into a realm of stone giants reaching toward heaven. The morning mist clings to scaffolding as hundreds of workers begin what will become the most ambitious construction project in human history. The castle building boom that follows is nothing short of extraordinary. You observe thousands of construction sites buzzing with activity as Europe enters its golden age of fortress construction. Between 1066 and 1300, over 40,000 castles rise across the continent, each one a testament to ambition carved in limestone and granite. You watch stonemasons arrive from distant quarries, their chisels ringing against blocks that will outlive empires. The sound echoes across valleys where future ruins will one day stand in silent testimony to this unprecedented building frenzy. In England alone, you count over 1,500 major fortifications sprouting from hilltops and river bends. Wales becomes particularly dense with castles. Edward's iron ring of fortresses emerges like stone flowers blooming along the Welsh coastline. You witness Caernarfon's massive walls taking shape, each stone positioned with mathematical precision that will inspire architects 7 centuries later. The quarries of Anglesey work day and night, their limestone travelling by barge to construction sites where master builders transform raw rock into architectural poetry. The engineering marvels you observe seem almost impossible for their era. Castle builders develop revolutionary techniques for foundation laying, creating structures that can support walls reaching heights of over 100 feet. You watch them solve problems of water supply, sewage management, and structural integrity that challenge even modern engineers. The concentric castle design emerges as the pinnacle of medieval military architecture, with multiple defensive rings creating fortresses within fortresses. Engineers perfect the art of creating murder holes, sally ports, and defendable gatehouses that can withstand sustained assault. The sheer scale of construction overwhelms contemporary observers. You witness entire forests disappearing to provide scaffolding timber, while limestone quarries expand into vast open pits that reshape the English countryside. The Tower of London alone consumes enough stone to build a small city, its white tower rising like a geometric mountain above the Thames. Continental castles grow even larger. Château Gaillard in Normandy becomes Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, a fortress so advanced that military engineers study its design for centuries. Historians still argue whether the explosive castle construction represents genuine military necessity or medieval status competition run wild. You notice how castle building becomes a kind of arms race among nobility, each lord attempting to outdo his neighbours with higher towers and thicker walls. The psychological impact proves as important as the military advantage. A well-positioned castle dominates the surrounding countryside through presence alone. Castle architects understand this perfectly, designing towers visible from 20 miles away to project power across entire regions. The economic engine driving this construction boom involves you in a complex web of medieval finance. Castle building requires massive capital investment, often consuming a lord's entire annual income for decades. You observe how William Marshall spends nearly 20 years' revenue constructing Chepstow Castle, mortgaging future generations to create his stone legacy. The limestone trade flourishes as quarries from Caen to Ancaster work overtime, supplying the insatiable demand for building stone. Entire merchant dynasties emerge from the castle construction industry, their wealth built literally on stone foundations. You discover quirky details about castle construction that reveal medieval ingenuity. Builders incorporate salt into mortar mixtures, creating bonds stronger than the original stone. Secret passages wind through walls not just for dramatic escapes, but for practical purposes like waste removal and surprise flanking maneuvers. Spiral staircases deliberately curve clockwise, giving defending swordsmen the advantage of wielding their weapons with their dominant right hands, while attackers struggle awkwardly. Some castle builders hide good luck charms within wall foundations. Archaeologists still discover medieval coins, religious tokens, and even children's toys sealed inside ancient masonry. The social transformation accompanying castle construction reshapes European civilization. You watch entire communities relocate as lords establish planned towns beneath their new fortresses. Markets spring up in castle courtyards, creating economic centres that will eventually grow into major cities. The feudal system crystallizes around these stone anchors, with castle ownership defining political power structures that endure for centuries. Villages that previously existed as loose agricultural settlements now organize themselves around the protective embrace of massive stone walls. Castle design reflects the medieval worldview in fascinating ways. You notice how religious symbolism integrates into fortress architecture. Tower heights often correspond to biblical numerology, and chapel placement follows sacred geometry principles. The Great Hall represents earthly power, while private chambers above symbolize the Lord's divine right to rule. Even defensive features carry spiritual significance, with battlements resembling crowns affirming noble authority. Castle builders frequently orient their constructions to align with celestial events, creating fortresses that function as massive stone calendars marking religious festivals and seasonal celebrations. The technical innovations emerging from castle construction influence civilian architecture for generations. You observe how castle builders pioneer advances in stone cutting, mortar composition, and load-bearing techniques that eventually transform cathedral construction. The pointed arch, ribbed vaulting, and flying buttress systems develop partly through fortress engineering experiments. Master masons move between castle and cathedral projects, carrying architectural knowledge that revolutionizes both military and sacred building traditions. The workforce assembling these monuments represents medieval Europe's greatest collaborative effort. You watch skilled craftsmen from across the continent converge on major construction sites. Welsh stoneworkers collaborate with Norman architects, while Flemish engineers share techniques with Italian master builders. The castle construction boom creates Europe's first truly international workforce, spreading technological innovation and cultural exchange across political boundaries. As this golden age reaches its zenith around 1300, you witness the peak of castle civilization. Fortresses have become small cities unto themselves, housing hundreds of residents within their walls. The greatest castles incorporate everything from libraries and chapels to workshops and gardens, creating self-sufficient communities that could withstand sieges lasting months or even years. Warwick Castle maintains its own mint, while Carefully Castle features elaborate water defences that transform the surrounding landscape into an artificial lake system. Yet even in these moments of triumph, you notice subtle signs of coming change. Cannon technology emerges in distant China, though its implications remain invisible to European castle builders. Political structures begin evolving in ways that will eventually challenge the entire feudal system. Economic patterns shift as trade routes develop beyond traditional castle-controlled highways. The seeds of transformation germinate quietly while castle construction reaches unprecedented heights of sophistication and scale. The magnificent castles surrounding you represent humanity's attempt to build permanence from stone, to create structures that will endure forever. You stand among these architectural giants at their moment of greatest power, unaware that forces already stirring will soon begin their inexorable work of transformation. The Golden Age blazes brilliantly, casting long shadows that will stretch across centuries of decay and ruin. You hear the thunderous crack that changes everything. The first cannon shot fired against castle walls in European warfare. The year is 1346, and you stand witness as gunpowder technology arrives from the east, carrying with it the seeds of every castle's eventual destruction. The sound reverberates through stone corridors that have echoed only with the clash of swords and the twang of crossbows for 3 centuries. Something fundamental shifts in this moment, though the full implications won't become clear for generations. The military revolution unfolding before you transforms warfare with breathtaking speed. You watch as primitive bombards, barely more than iron tubes packed with black powder, begin appearing at siege sites across Europe. These early cannons are crude, dangerous to their operators, and often more effective at terrifying defenders than actually breaching walls. Yet even in their primitive state, they represent a technological earthquake that will eventually topple every castle in Christendom. The psychological impact proves immediate. The very idea that walls can be shattered by thunder changes how people think about invincibility. Edward III's cannons at Calais in 1347 mark the beginning of the end for traditional fortification. You observe the clumsy bronze tubes being positioned outside the city walls, their crews more likely to be killed by their own weapons than by enemy arrows. The guns fire perhaps once per hour when conditions are perfect, lobbing stone balls that chip rather than shatter the ancient masonry. But the defenders know they're witnessing their own obsolescence. The sound alone, that earth-shaking roar that announces humanity's mastery over stone, signals the dawn of a new age of warfare. The evolution of artillery proceeds with relentless momentum. You trace the development from simple bombards to sophisticated siege cannons, capable of reducing castle walls to rubble within days rather than months. The Ottoman Empire becomes the master of this new technology, their massive cannons breaching Constantinople's legendary walls in 1453 after they had resisted siege for over 1,000 years. The thunderous bombardment lasts for weeks, each shot sending shockwaves through every castle in Europe as medieval lords realize their stone fortresses have become elaborate death traps. Historians still argue whether gunpowder weapons alone caused the decline of castle warfare, or whether they merely accelerated changes already underway. You notice how castle design begins adapting to the artillery threat even before cannons become truly effective. Star-shaped fortifications with low, thick walls start replacing tall medieval towers. Italian engineers pioneer the Tres Italienne design, creating fortresses that can withstand cannon fire while providing platforms for defensive artillery. But these adaptations prove ruinously expensive, and most existing castles cannot be economically modified to meet the new threat. The economic mathematics of siege warfare shifts dramatically in favour of attackers. Where medieval sieges could drag on for months or years, draining royal treasuries and requiring massive logistical support, artillery reduces most fortifications within weeks. You witness the Siege of Harfleur in 1415, where Henry's cannons breach walls that previously would have required elaborate siege engines, starvation tactics, or treacherous infiltration. The cost-benefit analysis of castle ownership begins tilting toward abandonment rather than modernisation. The social implications ripple through aristocratic society like shockwaves from cannon fire. Castle-based nobility built their power on the assumption that stone walls provided unassailable sanctuary. You observe how this military revolution undermines the entire feudal contract if castles can't protect their surrounding territories. What justifies noble authority? The common people begin questioning whether aristocratic privileges remain valid when lords can no longer guarantee security. Some nobles adapt by becoming gunpowder specialists themselves, but many cling to traditional chivalric ideals that artillery makes increasingly irrelevant. The technical challenges of artillery warfare force rapid innovation in metallurgy and chemistry. You watch foundries across Europe experimenting with bronze and iron cannon designs, each attempting to create weapons that won't explode and kill their own crews. The science of ballistics emerges as military engineers calculate trajectories, powder charges, and optimal projectile weights. Quirky details emerge from this experimentation. Some cannons are named like beloved pets, while others bear elaborate religious inscriptions asking divine blessing for their destructive work. The famous Mons Meg cannon at Edinburgh Castle weighs over 6 tons and requires a team of 40 men to load and fire. Castle defenders attempt various countermeasures against the artillery threat. You observe ingenious attempts to cushion walls with earth banks, timber bracing, and even hanging tapestries to absorb cannonball impacts. Some castle builders experiment with angled walls designed to deflect projectiles, while others dig deep moats to keep cannons at maximum range. The most creative solution involves building false walls in front of actual fortifications, creating a double defense system that forces attackers to breach multiple barriers. However, these modifications prove so expensive that most castle owners simply abandon their fortifications rather than invest in upgrades. The psychological warfare aspect of artillery proves as important as its physical destruction. You witness how the mere threat of cannon bombardment causes many castle garrisons to surrender without fighting. The sound of guns being brought into position outside walls creates panic among defenders who have never experienced such overwhelming firepower. Chroniclers describe grown knights weeping at the sound of bombardment, their entire worldview crumbling along with their stone walls. The romance of medieval warfare dies in the thunder of cannon fire, replaced by the grim mathematics of industrial destruction. Regional variations in artillery adoption create interesting strategic imbalances. The Ottoman Empire and Italian city-states embrace cannon technology enthusiastically, while conservative regions like rural England and Highland Scotland resist change longer. You observe how this technological gap creates military advantages that shift the balance of power between nations and regions. Areas that modernize their armies quickly can conquer regions still relying on traditional fortifications, accelerating the abandonment of obsolete castles. The transformation of military engineering redirects enormous resources away from castle maintenance toward artillery production. You watch royal budgets shift from funding stonemasons and castle garrisons towards supporting cannon foundries and gunpowder mills. The skilled craftsmen who once carved castle decorations find employment creating artillery equipment instead. This economic reallocation leaves existing castles without the financial support necessary for maintenance and modernization. The environmental impact of gunpowder warfare introduces new forms of destruction to medieval landscapes. Artillery bombardments create rubble fields around besieged castles, while cannon foundries consume vast quantities of wood and mineral resources. You observe how the search for saltpeter, a key gunpowder ingredient, leads to the systematic excavation of stable floors, cellar walls, and even graveyards. The chemical residues from gunpowder production contaminate local water supplies, while the smoke from artillery battles creates air pollution on a scale previously unknown in medieval warfare. The cultural shock of artillery extends beyond military circles into civilian society. You witness how gunpowder weapons challenge fundamental assumptions about valour, honour, and the nature of warfare itself. Traditional knights trained from childhood in swordsmanship and horsemanship find their skills irrelevant against crews of common artisans who can level castles from safe distances. The democratic aspect of artillery, that any peasant can learn to operate a cannon, threatens aristocratic monopolies on military power. The speed of technological change accelerates throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. You observe how cannon design improves with each generation, creating weapons capable of reducing the mightiest fortresses to rubble. The great Turkish bombard used against Constantinople can fire stone balls weighing over 600 pounds, creating impacts that shake buildings miles away. European foundries respond with innovations like wheeled gun carriages, standardized ammunition, and improved gunpowder formulations that increase both range and accuracy. As this military revolution reaches maturity, you recognize that every castle in Europe now faces the same inexorable fate. The stone giants that once seemed eternal have become artifacts of a vanished age, their massive walls transformed from shields into targets. The thunder of artillery marks not just the end of medieval warfare, but the beginning of a new relationship between technology and power that will reshape civilization itself. The golden age of castles dies in fire and smoke, leaving behind ruins that speak of humanity's endless capacity for both creation and destruction. You examine the ledger books of a 15th century English lord, watching his face grow pale as the numbers reveal a devastating truth. Maintaining his ancestral castle now costs more than his entire annual income. The parchment pages flutter in the candlelight, each entry recording another crushing expense: mason repairs, timber replacements, garrison wages, and provisions for a fortress that devours resources like a stone monster. This financial reality, multiplied across thousands of noble families throughout Europe, becomes the quiet executioner of more castles than any army ever conquered. The economics of castle ownership follow a brutal mathematical progression that dooms even the wealthiest families. You witness how a typical major fortress requires constant employment of at least 30 skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and roofers, simply to prevent structural decay. Each specialist commands wages that could support several peasant families, while their materials must often be transported from distant quarries and forests at enormous cost. The annual maintenance budget for a single large castle equals the total wealth of entire villages, creating financial burdens that compound generation after generation. Consider the example of Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, where you observe the Dudley family struggling with maintenance costs that spiral beyond control. The Great Keep alone requires reglazing of hundreds of windows annually, each pane of glass costing more than a master craftsman's monthly wages. The roof system demands replacement of thousands of lead tiles every few years, while the massive curtain walls need constant repointing of mortar joints to prevent water damage. By the 1550s, maintaining Kenilworth properly would consume the equivalent of £50,000 annually in modern currency, a sum that bankrupts even the most prosperous noble houses. The technical complexity of medieval castle construction creates maintenance challenges that grow exponentially over time. You watch master masons examining walls where centuries of freeze-thaw cycles have created hairline cracks that threaten structural integrity. Each repair requires specialized knowledge passed down through generations of stoneworkers. But this expertise becomes increasingly rare and expensive as fewer families can afford to employ such craftsmen full-time. The intricate carved stonework adorning castle facades demands restoration by artists whose skills command premium prices, while the engineering systems for water supply, drainage, and waste removal require constant attention from specialists who understand medieval hydraulics. Historians still argue whether the economic burden of castle maintenance represents the primary cause of fortress abandonment or merely accelerates decline driven by other factors. You discover how rising labour costs throughout the 14th and 15th centuries make castle upkeep progressively more expensive relative to noble incomes. The Black Death's demographic impact reduces the available workforce while simultaneously increasing wages for surviving craftsmen. Many castle owners find themselves competing for the services of skilled workers who can demand unprecedented compensation for their expertise. The heating and lighting costs alone become prohibitive for many castle owners. You calculate that keeping a major fortress adequately heated through a single winter requires burning quantities of wood equivalent to entire forests. The Great Hall of Warwick Castle consumes over 40 tons of oak annually just for its massive fireplaces, while lesser chambers need constant supplies of charcoal and candles to remain habitable. Transport costs multiply these expenses. Fuel must often travel hundreds of miles from sustainable timber sources to castles built on strategic but resource-poor locations. The garrison expenses represent another crushing financial burden that grows heavier with each passing decade. You observe how a properly defended castle requires year-round maintenance of at least 50 professional soldiers, each demanding competitive wages, food, equipment, and periodic replacement. These military salaries must be paid regardless of whether the castle faces any actual threats, creating fixed costs that drain noble treasuries during peacetime. Many castle owners attempt to reduce garrison sizes, but this penny-pinching approach often leads to theft, vandalism, and accelerated structural decay when properties lack adequate security. Quirky financial details emerge from castle account books that reveal the true scope of these economic challenges. Some nobles resort to renting out castle chambers to wealthy merchants, transforming military fortifications into early hotels to generate maintenance revenue. Others sell off valuable furnishings, artwork, and even architectural elements like carved stones and stained glass windows to raise emergency funds. The Earl of Somerset famously dismantled an entire tower at Raglan Castle, selling the stones to local builders rather than paying for proper maintenance of the structure. The agricultural changes sweeping through medieval Europe compound the financial pressures on castle owners. You witness how improved farming techniques increase rural productivity, but also reduce the number of serfs and tenants who traditionally provided unpaid labour for castle maintenance. The manorial system that once supplied castles with free workers begins breaking down as peasants gain economic independence and migrate to towns where they can earn cash wages. Castle owners must increasingly pay market rates for services that their ancestors received as feudal obligations. The rise of professional military forces creates additional economic pressures that make private castle ownership financially unsustainable. You observe how monarchs establish standing armies that provide superior defence at lower per capita costs than maintaining individual castle garrisons. Noble families find themselves taxed to support royal military forces, while simultaneously bearing the full cost of maintaining their own private fortifications. This double financial burden proves impossible for all but the wealthiest aristocrats to sustain over multiple generations. The inheritance patterns of medieval nobility create particularly devastating economic dynamics for castle maintenance. You trace how properties typically pass to eldest sons, who inherit both the castle and its associated debts. While younger siblings receive cash settlements that further drain estate resources, many heirs discover that their inheritance consists primarily of maintenance obligations that exceed available income. Some noble families attempt to break this cycle by selling ancestral properties. But the limited market for expensive, obsolete fortifications means they often recover only a fraction of their investment. The regional economic changes accompanying the decline of feudalism hit castle owners particularly hard. You witness how the growth of merchant capitalism and urban commerce shifts wealth away from land-based aristocracy toward commercial classes who have no interest in maintaining medieval fortifications. Traditional noble income sources, agricultural rents, feudal dues, and military service payments prove increasingly inadequate to support castle maintenance costs that continue rising regardless of economic conditions. The tax burden imposed by strengthening monarchies creates additional financial strain that forces many noble families to abandon their castles. You observe how royal taxation systems extract increasing percentages of noble income to fund centralised governments and professional armies. Castle owners find themselves caught between rising tax obligations and escalating maintenance costs. With insufficient resources to meet both demands, many choose to abandon expensive fortress properties rather than face bankruptcy trying to maintain them. The social costs of castle ownership extend beyond simple financial calculations to encompass opportunity costs that become increasingly difficult to justify. You notice how the resources required to maintain a single castle could instead fund multiple profitable commercial ventures, purchase productive agricultural lands, or invest in emerging industries. Younger generations of nobles often view ancestral castles as financial millstones that prevent family wealth from growing through more modern investment strategies. The building material costs for castle maintenance inflate dramatically throughout the later medieval period. You track how the price of quality limestone, oak timber, iron, and lead increases faster than noble incomes, creating an economic squeeze that makes major repairs financially impossible for all but royal families. The transportation expenses for moving heavy materials to remote castle locations multiply these costs further, while the specialised tools and equipment needed for castle construction become increasingly expensive as demand declines. As you close the ledger books and watch candles burn low in castle chambers that will soon stand empty, the mathematical inevitability becomes clear. The economic burden of maintaining these stone monuments has grown beyond the capacity of their owners to bear, creating a financial pressure that proves more effective than any siege engine at reducing proud fortresses to abandoned ruins. The golden age of castle civilization dies not in battle, but in bankruptcy, leaving behind empty shells that testify to the inexorable power of economic forces over even the mightiest human ambitions. You witness the transformation of European politics as monarchs across the continent systematically consolidate power, rendering private castles not just militarily obsolete, but politically dangerous. The year is 1485, and you observe Henry VII ascending the English throne with a clear understanding that scattered noble fortifications represent threats to royal authority that must be neutralised through policy rather than warfare. This political revolution unfolds quietly in council chambers and legal documents, but its impact on castle ownership proves more devastating than any military campaign. The centralisation of political power follows a deliberate strategy that makes private fortress ownership incompatible with emerging concepts of state sovereignty. You watch as monarchs like Louis the Fan of France and Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain establish professional bureaucracies that assume functions previously handled by castle-based noble authorities. Tax collection, legal administration, military recruitment, and law enforcement gradually shift from private noble control to centralised royal management. This bureaucratic revolution transforms castles from essential governmental infrastructure into redundant private residences that serve no legitimate political function. The legal framework surrounding castle ownership undergoes fundamental changes that undermine traditional feudal relationships. You observe how royal lawyers develop new interpretations of property law that distinguish between private residence rights and governmental authority. The ancient concept that castle ownership automatically confers judicial and military power over surrounding territories becomes legally obsolete as monarchs assert exclusive state monopolies over these functions. Noble families discover that their ancestral fortifications have been transformed from seats of legitimate authority into potential bases for illegal rebellion. The licensing and demolition policies implemented by strengthening monarchs create systematic pressure for castle abandonment throughout Europe. You witness Henry VIII's methodical approach to controlling private fortifications through his licensing system, which requires royal permission for maintaining castle defences while simultaneously making such licences increasingly difficult to obtain. The implied threat becomes clear. Nobles who cannot justify their military capabilities face forced demolition of their fortifications, while those who attempt to maintain castles without proper authorization risk charges of treason. Historians still argue whether political centralization represents a natural evolution of governmental efficiency or a deliberate strategy to eliminate potential sources of aristocratic rebellion. You notice how the timing of these political changes coincides suspiciously with periods of royal weakness, suggesting that monarchs use centralization policies to prevent noble uprisings during succession crises or foreign wars. The systematic nature of these reforms across multiple kingdoms indicates coordinated efforts to transform the fundamental relationship between crown and nobility. The rise of professional standing armies provides monarchs with military capabilities that make private castle garrisons politically threatening rather than strategically valuable. You observe how royal forces equipped with artillery and disciplined infantry can rapidly suppress any noble rebellion, regardless of how well fortified the rebel strongholds might be. This military reality makes castle ownership a liability rather than an asset for noble families who wish to maintain good relationships with their monarchs. Many aristocrats voluntarily abandon their fortifications to demonstrate loyalty and avoid suspicion of treasonous intentions. The economic policies of centralizing monarchs systematically undermine the financial foundations that made castle ownership viable. You witness how royal tax systems extract increasing percentages of noble wealth to fund centralized governments and professional military forces simultaneously. Monarchs restrict the traditional revenue sources that supported castle maintenance, feudal dues, private taxation rights, and military service payments, through legal reforms that transfer these income streams to royal control. Noble families find themselves financially unable to maintain castles, while legally prohibited from generating the revenues that made such maintenance historically possible. The diplomatic implications of private castle ownership become increasingly problematic as European politics evolve towards centralized nation-states. You observe how foreign ambassadors and papal representatives begin dealing exclusively with royal courts, rather than individual noble strongholds, reducing castles from centres of international diplomacy to local curiosities. The protocol of medieval statecraft, which previously required foreign dignitaries to pay courtesy visits to major castle owners, gives way to centralized diplomatic procedures that bypass noble authorities entirely. Quirky examples of political pressure emerge from royal archives that reveal the subtle methods used to discourage castle ownership. Some monarchs implement special taxes on fortified residences while offering tax incentives for nobles who convert their castles to unfortified manor houses. Others establish royal garrisons in strategic locations that make nearby private castles militarily redundant while demonstrating overwhelming royal military presence. The most creative approach involves royal purchasing programs that buy castle properties at inflated prices before systematically demolishing them to prevent future use by potential rebels. The religious implications of political centralization add another layer of pressure against castle ownership. You witness how monarchs increasingly present themselves as divinely appointed rulers whose authority cannot be legitimately challenged by private fortress owners. The theological justifications for royal supremacy make castle-based resistance appear not just treasonous, but sacrilegious, creating moral pressure that supplements legal and economic incentives for fortress abandonment. Castle chapels lose their religious significance as royal court ceremonies assume primary importance in demonstrating divine favour. The administrative efficiency arguments for political centralisation create intellectual justification for eliminating private castle authorities. You observe how royal bureaucrats demonstrate superior effectiveness in tax collection, law enforcement and judicial administration compared to the traditional system of castle-based noble governance. These efficiency gains provide practical justification for transferring governmental functions from private fortress owners to centralised royal administration, making castle ownership appear backward and inefficient rather than traditional and prestigious. The cultural transformation accompanying political centralisation gradually shifts aristocratic identity away from military fortress ownership toward court-based social prominence. You watch as noble families increasingly measure their status through proximity to royal courts, rather than the strength of their private fortifications. The medieval ideal of the castle-based warrior aristocrat gives way to new concepts of courtly nobility that emphasise diplomatic skill, cultural refinement, and royal service over military independence and territorial control. The international examples of political centralisation create pressure for monarchs to adopt similar policies or risk appearing weak compared to their royal counterparts. You trace how the success of French royal centralisation under Louis the Famine influences English royal policy under Henry VII, while Spanish unification under Ferdinand and Isabella provides a model for other European kingdoms. The competitive dynamic between monarchs creates a continental trend toward political centralisation that makes private castle ownership increasingly anomalous. The legal precedents established during this period of political centralisation create lasting frameworks that continue influencing property law for centuries. You observe how royal lawyers develop concepts of state sovereignty that permanently subordinate private property rights to governmental authority. These legal innovations establish precedents that future governments use to justify further restrictions on private fortification ownership, creating a legal trajectory that makes the revival of castle-based political power practically impossible. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of centralising monarchs make private castle ownership strategically counterproductive for noble families. You witness how royal spy networks systematically monitor castle activities, creating surveillance pressure that makes fortress-based privacy impossible to maintain. Noble families discover that their private communications, military preparations, and political discussions within castle walls become known to royal authorities, transforming their fortifications from protective sanctuaries into transparent observation points for government intelligence services. The succession planning strategies of noble families begin factoring political realities that make castle inheritance potentially dangerous rather than valuable. You observe how aristocratic parents increasingly advise their heirs to avoid castle ownership that might attract unwanted royal attention or create financial burdens that exceed political benefits. Some noble families deliberately allow their ancestral fortifications to fall into ruin rather than risk accusations of maintaining potential bases for rebellion against royal authority. The transformation of military technology compounds political pressures by making private castle defences militarily insignificant against professional royal armies. You notice how the combination of artillery, disciplined infantry, and centralised military logistics creates overwhelming advantages for monarchs that make noble fortress resistance futile. This military reality reinforces political arguments for abandoning castle ownership while demonstrating the practical impossibility of using private fortifications to challenge royal authority. As you observe this political transformation reaching completion, the fundamental relationship between monarchy and nobility has been permanently altered. The castle, once the symbol and substance of aristocratic power, becomes a relic of a political system that centralised monarchy has rendered obsolete. The stone walls that once protected noble independence now represent obstacles to political survival in an age where royal favour matters more than fortress strength. The great castles of Europe stand empty not because they were conquered, but because their political purpose has simply ceased to exist. You step through the transformation of aristocratic taste as Renaissance ideals sweep across Europe. Watching noble families abandon their cold, draughty castles for elegant palaces designed around comfort rather than defence. The year is 1520, and you observe Italian architects arriving at French and English estates with revolutionary plans that prioritise large windows, flowing interior spaces, and decorative gardens over thick walls and narrow murder holes. This architectural revolution reflects a fundamental shift in how the wealthy perceive civilized living, making medieval fortresses seem barbarically uncomfortable rather than impressively formidable. The Renaissance palace represents everything medieval castles are not: bright, warm, spacious, and designed for pleasure rather than survival. You witness the construction of chateaux in the Loire Valley, where French nobles embrace Italian innovations like symmetrical facades, classical columns, and expansive window arrangements that would have been suicidal in military architecture. The contrast becomes stark when you compare Chambord's soaring galleries and intricate staircases with the cramped, defensive passages of traditional castles. These new residences demonstrate that true sophistication requires sacrificing military security for aesthetic refinement. The cultural influence of Italian Renaissance courts creates irresistible pressure for aristocratic architectural modernization throughout Europe. You observe how exposure to Florentine and Roman palace design makes northern European nobles view their ancestral castles as embarrassingly provincial. The smooth, decorated walls of Italian palazzi seem infinitely more civilized than rough stone fortifications covered with defensive projections. Noble families begin to perceive castle ownership as a mark of cultural backwardness that undermines their social standing among cosmopolitan European aristocracy. The practical advantages of palace-style architecture become immediately obvious to anyone who has endured a winter in a medieval castle. You experience the revolutionary comfort of rooms designed around human habitation rather than military necessity. Renaissance palaces feature proper heating systems, adequate natural lighting, and interior layouts that facilitate social interaction rather than defensive positioning. The simple pleasure of walking through corridors without constantly ducking under low defensive passages makes palace life seem civilized in ways that castle living never achieved. Historians still argue whether architectural fashion changes represent genuine improvements in living standards, or merely superficial aesthetic preferences driven by competitive social display. You notice how the timing of architectural modernization coincides with periods of relative political stability, when military defense becomes less critical than social prestige. The shift from fortress to palace reflects broader changes in aristocratic priorities as warfare becomes professionalized, and noble families focus increasingly on cultural rather than military leadership. The economic implications of architectural modernization create additional pressure for castle abandonment as noble families invest their resources in fashionable new construction. You witness how building a proper Renaissance palace requires enormous capital investment that makes maintaining both old castles and new residences financially impossible. Most aristocratic families choose to concentrate their resources on creating impressive modern homes, rather than dividing their wealth between maintaining obsolete fortifications and building contemporary residences. The construction boom in palace architecture draws skilled craftsmen and financial resources away from castle maintenance. The social functions of aristocratic residences undergo fundamental transformation as Renaissance culture emphasizes hospitality, artistic patronage, and intellectual discourse over military leadership. You observe how palace design facilitates elaborate social gatherings, theatrical performances, and scholarly discussions that become central to aristocratic identity. The great halls of medieval castles, designed for military councils and feudal ceremonies, prove inadequate for the sophisticated social rituals that define Renaissance court culture. Noble families discover that their social status depends increasingly on their ability to host impressive cultural events, rather than demonstrate military prowess. The technological innovations in construction techniques make Renaissance palace architecture significantly superior to medieval fortress design in terms of structural engineering and environmental comfort. You witness how Renaissance builders develop advanced heating systems, improved window glazing, and sophisticated interior decoration techniques that create living environments far more pleasant than anything achievable within castle constraints. The technical knowledge accumulated during castle construction periods provides the engineering foundation for palace architecture, but the removal of military requirements allows architects to prioritize human comfort and aesthetic beauty. Quirky details of the transition from castle to palace reveal the practical challenges faced by noble families attempting to modernize their living arrangements. Some aristocrats attempt to retrofit their castles with Renaissance features, creating bizarre hybrid structures that satisfy neither military nor aesthetic requirements. Others construct palace wings attached to existing castle keeps, creating architectural compositions that demonstrate the transition from medieval to Renaissance values. The most dramatic approach involves completely demolishing ancestral castles to make room for fashionable palace construction, erasing centuries of family history in favour of contemporary architectural style. The international character of Renaissance architectural influence creates competitive pressure for aristocratic modernisation across national boundaries. You observe how English nobles visiting French chateaux return home convinced that their traditional castles appear primitive by continental standards. German princes touring Italian palaces similarly become embarrassed by their fortress residences and begin planning comprehensive architectural modernization projects. This international competition in architectural sophistication accelerates the abandonment of castle living as noble families strive to maintain their reputations within European high society. The artistic and intellectual culture associated with Renaissance palace life makes castle environments seem intellectually stifling rather than romantically atmospheric. You witness how palace libraries, art galleries, and music rooms create spaces for cultural activities that castles cannot accommodate due to their military design constraints. The narrow windows and thick walls that provide military security also block natural light needed for reading, painting, and scholarly work. Noble families increasingly view cultural patronage as more important than military capability, making palace architecture essential for maintaining their social roles as intellectual leaders. The garden design revolution accompanying Renaissance architecture makes castle courtyards appear cramped and utilitarian compared to elaborate palace landscapes. You observe the creation of formal gardens, fountain systems, and recreational spaces that require extensive grounds impossible to accommodate within defensive castle walls. The aesthetic integration of residence and landscape becomes a crucial element of aristocratic prestige, making isolated castle hilltops seem isolated and disconnected from the natural beauty that Renaissance culture celebrates through garden design. The changing concepts of privacy and domestic comfort make castle living arrangements seem primitive rather than impressive to Renaissance sensibilities. You notice how palace design creates distinct spaces for different activities: private family quarters, formal reception areas, service facilities, and guest accommodations, while castle design subordinates all functions to military requirements. The ability to separate public and private life becomes a mark of sophisticated civilization that castle architecture cannot provide due to its defensive layout constraints. The religious and philosophical changes accompanying the Renaissance create cultural contexts that make fortress living seem inconsistent with Christian and humanistic values. You observe how Renaissance thinkers emphasize peace, learning, and artistic creation over military violence, making castle ownership appear to celebrate values that educated society increasingly rejects. The humanistic philosophy that influences Renaissance culture views fortress architecture as representing humanity's worst impulses rather than its finest achievements. The diplomatic and political advantages of palace architecture make castle ownership strategically counterproductive for noble families seeking political influence. You witness how Renaissance monarchs establish their courts in elegant palaces that set standards for aristocratic architecture throughout their kingdoms. Noble families who continue living in military castles appear to reject royal cultural leadership and demonstrate dangerous attachment to independent military capability. The political wisdom of architectural conformity makes palace construction a necessity for maintaining good relationships with centralizing monarchs. The professional specialization in architectural design creates expertise in palace construction that makes castle renovation increasingly difficult and expensive. You observe how the most skilled architects focus their careers on palace projects rather than fortress restoration, creating a knowledge gap that makes proper castle maintenance technically challenging. The artistic and engineering innovations that drive Renaissance architecture development concentrate on palace design, leaving castle technology increasingly obsolete and difficult to maintain properly. The gender dynamics of Renaissance aristocratic culture create additional pressure for architectural modernization as noble women gain influence over domestic arrangements. You notice how palace design accommodates female social leadership in ways that castle architecture cannot, providing spaces for the salons, cultural gatherings, and artistic patronage that becomes central to aristocratic women's roles. The comfort and aesthetic beauty of palace life appeals particularly to noble women who have historically borne the greatest burden of castle living's practical difficulties. As this architectural transformation reaches maturity, you recognize that the shift from castle to palace represents more than mere fashion change. It reflects a fundamental transformation in how European nobility defines civilization itself. The stone fortresses that once symbolized aristocratic power now appear barbaric compared to the elegant residences that demonstrate cultural refinement and intellectual sophistication. The great age of castle civilization ends not in destruction, but in obsolescence, as its former inhabitants discover more pleasant ways to display their wealth and status. You witness the violent dissolution of monastic life across Europe as religious reformation tears apart the medieval world, leaving countless ecclesiastical castles abandoned like empty shells scattered across the countryside. The year is 1536, and you watch Henry VIII's commissioners arriving at Fountains Abbey with sledgehammers and legal documents, beginning a systematic destruction of religious institutions that will ultimately claim over 800 monasteries in England alone. This religious earthquake doesn't just destroy spiritual communities, it eliminates the economic and social foundations that sustained many of Europe's most impressive castle monasteries. The scale of monastic castle ownership across medieval Europe proves staggering when you examine the records. You discover that religious orders controlled nearly 30% of all fortified structures on the continent, from massive abbey castles like Mont Saint-Michel to smaller priory fortifications scattered throughout rural regions. These ecclesiastical strongholds served dual purposes as spiritual centres and military installations, their walls protecting not only monks and manuscripts, but also vast agricultural estates, pilgrimage routes, and strategic river crossings. When Reformation upheavals eliminate these religious communities, their castle properties lose both purpose and maintenance support simultaneously. The English dissolution of the monasteries creates the most dramatic single episode of castle abandonment in European history. You observe Thomas Cromwell's systematic campaign to seize monastic properties worth over £100,000 annually, equivalent to billions in modern currency. The commissioners arrive at great castle abbeys like Glastonbury and Tintern with orders to strip everything valuable. Lead roofing, stained glass windows, carved stones, and even the bells from towers. What cannot be removed profitably gets deliberately destroyed to prevent any possibility of religious restoration. Within 5 years, centuries of monastic civilization vanish from the English landscape. The Protestant Reformation's impact extends far beyond England to devastate ecclesiastical castle ownership across northern Europe. You witness similar scenes of destruction in German territories where Lutheran princes seize Catholic monastery castles, in Scandinavian kingdoms where royal authorities appropriate church fortifications, and in Swiss cantons where reformed communities dismantle religious strongholds. The theological justifications for these seizures vary, but the practical result remains consistent. Thousands of castle monasteries lose their religious purpose and economic support within a single generation. Historians still argue whether religious reformation represents genuine spiritual renewal or convenient political justification for seizing valuable church properties. You notice how the timing of monastic dissolutions often coincides with royal financial crises, suggesting that economic motives drive religious policy as much as theological conviction. The systematic nature of property seizures across different Protestant territories indicates coordinated efforts to transfer wealth from religious to secular authorities rather than spontaneous spiritual movements. The economic disruption caused by monastic dissolution creates cascading effects that devastate rural communities dependent on ecclesiastical castle centres. You observe how monastery castles traditionally served as economic hubs that provided employment for hundreds of craftsmen, agricultural workers, and service providers. The sudden elimination of these institutions destroys local economies built around religious tourism, agricultural production, and craft manufacturing. Villages that previously thrived in the shadow of great abbey castles often shrink to hamlet size or disappear entirely when their economic foundation vanishes. The architectural vandalism accompanying religious reformation results in the deliberate destruction of some of Europe's finest castle architecture. You watch Reformation zealots systematically destroying religious artwork, carved decorations, and architectural details that took centuries to create. The iconoclastic fury extends beyond removing religious symbols to encompass wholesale destruction of buildings deemed associated with papist superstition. Many castle monasteries suffer more damage from Reformation violence than they ever endured from military sieges. Quirky examples of monastic castle transformation reveal the creative ways that new owners attempt to adapt religious fortifications for secular purposes. Some dissolved monasteries become private residences, where former chapels serve as dining halls, and cloisters transform into formal gardens. Others become industrial facilities where monastery workshops house textile manufacturing or brewing operations. The most unusual conversions involve transforming castle abbeys into hunting lodges, where former prayer chambers become game storage and scriptorium become trophy rooms. These adaptations often prove architecturally awkward and economically unsuccessful. The manuscript and library destruction that accompanies monastic dissolution represents one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. You witness the burning of irreplaceable books, documents, and artistic treasures that monasteries had preserved for centuries. Many castle monasteries maintained extensive libraries that contained unique historical records, scientific treatises, and literary works. When these institutions close, their intellectual treasures often face deliberate destruction by reformers who view medieval manuscripts as sources of religious corruption. Some books survive by being sold as wastepaper or used for practical purposes like binding new publications. The pilgrimage economy collapse creates additional pressure for ecclesiastical castle abandonment as religious tourism revenues disappear virtually overnight. You observe how castle monasteries located along major pilgrimage routes lose their primary source of external income when Protestant authorities discourage or prohibit religious pilgrimages. The hostels, shops, and service industries that developed around these spiritual destinations face economic ruin when pilgrims stop visiting. Many ecclesiastical castles that might have survived other challenges cannot overcome the loss of pilgrimage-related revenues. The legal complications surrounding monastic property seizure create complex ownership disputes that prevent proper maintenance of many ecclesiastical castles. You witness how unclear legal title to former religious properties leads to prolonged court battles between crown authorities, local nobles, and displaced religious communities. During these ownership disputes, castle maintenance suffers as no party wants to invest in properties that might ultimately belong to someone else. Many ecclesiastical castles deteriorate rapidly during these legal uncertainties. The social displacement caused by monastic dissolution eliminates the human communities that maintained ecclesiastical castles for generations. You observe how the expulsion of monastic residents destroys accumulated knowledge about castle maintenance, architectural details, and local history that existed nowhere else. The skilled craftsmen who traditionally served monastery castles scatter to find employment elsewhere, taking with them technical expertise that proves irreplaceable. The loss of institutional continuity makes proper castle maintenance practically impossible, even when new owners have adequate financial resources. The regional variations in Reformation impact create different patterns of ecclesiastical castle abandonment across Europe. You notice how Catholic territories that resist Protestant Reformation often maintain their monastery castles, while areas that embrace religious change experience wholesale destruction of ecclesiastical fortifications. Some regions attempt moderate approaches that preserve castle architecture while eliminating religious functions. But these compromises often prove unstable and lead to eventual abandonment anyway. The political implications of ecclesiastical castle seizure extend beyond religious policy to encompass fundamental questions about property rights and governmental authority. You witness how monastic dissolution establishes precedents for state appropriation of private property that later governments use to justify further expropriations. The legal framework developed for seizing religious properties creates governmental capabilities that threaten all traditional property ownership patterns. The artistic and cultural impact of ecclesiastical castle destruction extends far beyond the immediate religious sphere to influence European civilization's entire trajectory. You observe how the loss of monastic scriptoriums, art workshops, and educational institutions reduces cultural production and intellectual activity throughout affected regions. The elimination of ecclesiastical patronage removes crucial support for artists, scholars, and craftsmen who depend on religious institutions for employment and creative opportunities. The environmental consequences of monastic dissolution affect castle monastery landscapes that had been carefully maintained for centuries. You witness how the agricultural systems, fish ponds, herb gardens, and managed forests that surrounded ecclesiastical castles fall into neglect when their monastic caretakers disappear. The sophisticated environmental management that religious communities developed around their fortifications deteriorates rapidly without institutional continuity. The international diplomatic implications of religious reformation create additional pressures that affect ecclesiastical castle ownership, even in territories that remain officially Catholic. You observe how the threat of Protestant expansion forces Catholic authorities to reform their own monastic institutions, often resulting in consolidation or closure of smaller monastery castles that cannot meet new efficiency standards. The competitive pressure between reformed and traditional religious institutions accelerates changes that ultimately reduce ecclesiastical castle ownership across all of Europe. The psychological trauma experienced by displaced monastic communities creates human costs that extend far beyond architectural destruction. You witness elderly monks and nuns who have spent entire lifetimes in castle monasteries forced to abandon their homes and spiritual vocations. The dissolution of religious communities that had existed for centuries destroys social networks, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions that took generations to develop. As this religious transformation reaches completion, you recognize that the Reformation has accomplished what centuries of warfare could never achieve: the systematic elimination of ecclesiastical castle civilization across vast regions of Europe. The spiritual fortresses that once seemed as eternal as their stone walls have vanished along with the faith communities that created and sustained them. The age of castle monasteries ends not in military defeat, but in religious revolution that transforms the very foundations of European civilization. You observe the transformation of European agriculture as innovative farming techniques revolutionize rural productivity, drawing populations away from castle-dependent communities toward more prosperous agricultural regions. The year is 1650, and you witness the introduction of crop rotation systems, selective breeding programs, and improved ploughing methods that increase food production while reducing the labor force needed for farming. This agricultural revolution creates demographic shifts that leave many castle towns without the human populations necessary to sustain fortress communities, accelerating the abandonment of rural strongholds across the continent. The three-field system gives way to more sophisticated agricultural practices that concentrate farming activities in regions with optimal soil conditions and transportation networks. You watch as innovative farmers develop four-field and even five-field rotation systems that dramatically increase crop yields per acre while simultaneously improving soil fertility. These intensive farming methods prove most effective on large, consolidated estates, rather than the scattered small holdings traditionally associated with castle-based manorial systems. The economic advantages of consolidated agriculture create powerful incentives for rural populations to abandon castle regions in favour of more productive farming areas. The selective breeding of livestock represents another agricultural innovation that transforms rural demographics in ways that undermine castle community sustainability. You observe how scientific breeding programs develop cattle, sheep, and pigs that produce significantly more meat, milk, and wool per animal than traditional medieval livestock. These improved breeds require specialized knowledge, better facilities, and larger operational scales that prove incompatible with the small-scale, defensive-oriented agriculture that characterizes castle-dominated regions. Farmers who adopt these innovations often relocate to areas where they can implement advanced techniques without the constraints imposed by fortress-centered land organization. The introduction of new crops from the Americas creates agricultural opportunities that shift European farming patterns away from traditional castle regions. You witness the cultivation of potatoes, maize, and various beans that thrive in previously marginal agricultural areas while providing superior nutritional value per acre compared to traditional European grains. These new crops enable farming communities to achieve prosperity in regions that were previously considered unsuitable for intensive agriculture, reducing dependence on the established agricultural system centered around castle communities. Historians still argue whether agricultural improvements represent the primary cause of rural depopulation around castles, or merely accelerate demographic changes driven by other economic forces. You notice how the timing of agricultural innovation coincides with broader economic transformations that make traditional feudal relationships obsolete. The scientific approach to farming that characterizes the agricultural revolution requires educational levels and capital investments that prove incompatible with the subsistence-oriented agriculture that historically supported castle communities. The transportation improvements that accompany agricultural modernization create market access opportunities that make remote castle regions economically disadvantageous for farming operations. You observe the construction of improved roads, canal systems, and river navigation improvements that connect productive agricultural regions directly to urban markets. These transportation networks often bypass traditional castle locations that were chosen for military rather than commercial considerations, leaving fortress communities isolated from the economic opportunities that drive agricultural prosperity. The enclosure movement that sweeps across Europe eliminates the common lands and collective farming practices that historically sustained castle-dependent rural populations. You witness how large landowners consolidate small holdings into efficient agricultural enterprises that require fewer workers while producing greater outputs. The enclosed fields and specialized farming operations that result from this consolidation often locate themselves in areas with optimal agricultural conditions rather than defensive positions, drawing rural populations away from castle regions toward more productive farming areas. Quirky agricultural innovations reveal the creative ways that farming improvements transform rural society in directions incompatible with castle community maintenance. Some regions develop specialized crop cultivation that requires specific climate and soil conditions, found only in particular geographic areas, creating agricultural centers of excellence that attract farmers from traditional castle regions. Others establish livestock breeding programs that demand extensive grazing lands available only in areas unsuitable for fortress construction. The most successful agricultural innovations often occur in river valleys and coastal plains that provide natural advantages for farming, but offer no defensive benefits for castle construction. The scientific revolution's impact on agriculture introduces systematic approaches to farming that require educational resources and technical knowledge typically unavailable in isolated castle communities. You observe how agricultural innovation depends increasingly on literacy, mathematical calculation, and scientific methodology that flourish in educational centers rather than rural fortresses. The knowledge networks that support advanced farming techniques develop around universities, commercial centers, and royal courts rather than the military-oriented institutions traditionally associated with castle communities. The capital investment requirements for agricultural modernization create financial pressures that make castle maintenance economically counterproductive for rural landowners. You witness how improved farming techniques demand significant upfront investments in better tools, superior livestock, and enhance facilities that generate returns only through increased agricultural productivity. Landowners face choices between investing their resources in agricultural improvements or castle maintenance, with economic logic favouring productive agriculture over defensive fortification in an era of reduced military threats. The demographic changes resulting from agricultural revolution create cascading effects that undermine the social foundations of castle communities. You observe how improved food production supports larger populations, but these expanded demographic patterns concentrate in agricultural regions rather than fortress locations. The rural population growth that might historically have strengthened castle communities instead flows toward farming areas that offer better economic opportunities and living conditions. The seasonal labour patterns associated with advanced agriculture create migration flows that draw workers away from castle regions during critical periods of the farming cycle. You notice how specialised agricultural techniques require concentrated labour inputs during planting, cultivation, and harvest seasons that conflict with the year-round residence patterns necessary for maintaining castle communities. Many rural workers discover that seasonal agricultural employment in productive farming regions provides better economic opportunities than permanent residence in declining castle communities. The environmental management practices that accompany agricultural modernization often prove incompatible with the defensive considerations that govern castle location and design. You observe how advanced farming techniques require careful watershed management, soil conservation, and forest management practices that work best in integrated agricultural landscapes rather than the fragmented territories characteristic of castle-dominated regions. The environmental optimization that supports productive agriculture often conflicts with the strategic positioning requirements that determine castle placement. The commercial agriculture development that emerges from farming improvements creates market relationships that bypass traditional castle-based economic systems. You witness how specialized crop production and livestock breeding operations establish direct relationships with urban merchants and international traders rather than working through the feudal intermediaries historically associated with castle communities. These direct market relationships provide farmers with better prices and more reliable income streams than the traditional agricultural arrangements centered around fortress communities. The technological innovations in agricultural equipment require manufacturing capabilities and maintenance services that concentrate in commercial centers rather than isolated castle regions. You observe how improved plows, harvesting tools, and processing equipment depend on skilled metal workers and mechanical specialists who establish their workshops in market towns rather than fortress communities. The technological support systems that enable agricultural modernization develop in locations chosen for commercial rather than defensive advantages. The educational requirements for advanced agriculture create knowledge networks that center around commercial and academic institutions rather than military fortifications. You notice how successful implementation of agricultural innovations requires access to written materials, technical training, and expert consultation that prove more readily available in commercial centers than in isolated castle communities. The intellectual resources that support agricultural revolution concentrate in locations that offer educational advantages rather than defensive security. The credit and financing systems that enable agricultural investment develop around commercial banking institutions rather than the traditional feudal relationships associated with the castle communities. You witness how farmers seeking capital for agricultural improvements find better financing terms from commercial lenders than from traditional feudal lords, who typically lack the liquid capital necessary to support modernization projects. These financial relationships create economic dependencies that orient successful farmers toward commercial centers rather than fortress communities. The international trade opportunities created by agricultural specialization establish economic relationships that transcend the local and regional markets traditionally served by castle-centered communities. You observe how specialized agricultural production connects rural areas directly to international trading networks that offer better prices and more diverse market opportunities than local castle-based commerce. These international economic relationships reduce the importance of local fortress communities while enhancing the value of locations with good transportation access to distant markets. As this agricultural transformation reaches maturity, you recognize that the revolution in farming has fundamentally altered the economic geography of rural Europe in ways that make castle communities obsolete. The prosperity that now flows from scientific agriculture concentrates in regions chosen for productive rather than defensive advantages, leaving the great fortresses as isolated monuments to a vanished way of life. The castle age ends not in warfare, but in the quiet migration of rural populations toward more promising agricultural futures. You witness the emergence of new transportation networks that systematically bypass traditional castle-controlled routes, undermining the economic foundations that made fortress communities viable for centuries. The year is 1700, and you observe engineers surveying direct routes between major commercial centres, their plans deliberately avoiding the circuitous paths that historically funneled travellers through castle toll stations. This transportation revolution creates alternative pathways that render castle-dominated medieval highways obsolete, leaving fortress communities isolated from the commercial traffic that once sustained their prosperity. The construction of turnpike roads represents the most visible challenge to castle-based transportation control systems. You watch as private investment companies build improved highways that connect major cities through the most efficient possible routes, prioritizing speed and convenience over the strategic considerations that determined medieval road networks. These modern highways often run through valleys and plains that medieval engineers avoided for defensive reasons, creating transportation corridors that completely bypass castle regions located on defensive hilltops and strategic choke points. The canal-building boom that sweeps across Europe creates entirely new transportation networks that ignore traditional overland routes controlled by castle-based authorities. You observe the construction of elaborate waterway systems that connect river networks, enabling cargo transportation that avoids roads entirely. The Grand Canal du Midi in France, the Bridgewater Canal in England, and similar projects across the continent establish water transportation routes that render traditional castle-controlled highways irrelevant for commercial purposes. These canal systems often pass through regions with no significant castle presence, creating new economic geographies that exclude fortress communities. The improved river navigation projects that accompany canal construction create additional transportation alternatives that bypass castle-controlled overland routes. You witness systematic efforts to remove obstacles, deepen channels, and construct locks that make river transportation reliable and efficient throughout entire watershed systems. Rivers that previously required supplementation with overland travel through castle-controlled territories become navigable for their entire lengths, enabling merchants to avoid traditional toll stations and route controls that sustained fortress communities economically. Historians still argue whether transportation improvements represent deliberate efforts to circumvent castle authority or natural consequences of engineering efficiency seeking optimal routes between economic centres. You notice how the planning documents for major transportation projects consistently avoid existing castle locations, suggesting systematic efforts to establish independent commercial networks rather than accidentally bypassing fortress communities. The deliberate nature of this route selection indicates conscious policy decisions to reduce noble control over commercial transportation. The bridge construction programs that accompany road and canal development eliminate many of the geographic bottlenecks that made castle positions strategically valuable. You observe how improved bridge engineering enables direct crossings of rivers, valleys, and other natural obstacles that previously forced travellers through castle-controlled passages. The construction of stone bridges with multiple arches, drawbridge systems with reliable mechanical operation, and ford improvements that enable year-round crossing eliminates the geographical advantages that made castle locations economically strategic. The coaching system development creates standardized transportation services that operate independently of castle-based hospitality and route control networks. You witness the establishment of coaching inns, relay stations, and scheduled services that provide travellers with predictable, reliable transportation options that bypass traditional castle accommodations. These commercial transportation systems offer superior speed, comfort, and security compared to medieval travel arrangements that depended on castle-based services, creating competitive pressures that undermine fortress community economic viability. Quirky transportation innovations reveal the creative engineering solutions that eliminate castle route control systems. Some regions develop elevated roadways that pass over traditional defensive positions rather than through them, creating transportation corridors that cannot be controlled by fortress communities. Others establish underground passages that enable commercial traffic to bypass surface routes entirely, removing castle communities from transportation networks altogether. The most dramatic innovations involve movable bridges and ferry systems that create temporary transportation connections across previously impassable barriers. The postal service development that accompanies transportation improvements establishes communication networks that operate independently of castle-based message relay systems. You observe how royal postal services and commercial courier systems establish their own route networks with dedicated facilities and professional staff. These communication systems often bypass castle communities entirely, using transportation routes optimized for speed rather than security. The reliable postal networks that emerge from these improvements reduce dependence on castle-based communication services while demonstrating the efficiency advantages of centralized transportation planning. The economic implications of transportation network changes create systematic competitive disadvantages for castle-based commercial operations. You witness how improved transportation reduces travel costs and time between major economic centers, making the additional expenses associated with castle-controlled routes economically uncompetitive. Merchants discover that avoiding traditional castle routes enables them to offer better prices and faster delivery than competitors who continue using medieval transportation networks, creating market pressures that gradually eliminate castle-dependent commercial traffic. The military implications of transportation improvements reduce the strategic value of castle positions, while simultaneously making fortress communities more vulnerable to external threats. You notice how improved roads enable rapid military movements that can bypass castle positions entirely, rendering fortress locations strategically irrelevant for controlling territorial access. Simultaneously, these transportation improvements enable potential attackers to approach castle positions from unexpected directions using routes that medieval fortress designers never anticipated. Making traditional defensive systems less effective, the regulatory changes that accompany transportation improvements eliminate many of the legal privileges that enabled castle communities to control commercial traffic. You observe how central governments establish transportation policies that guarantee free passage rights and prohibit arbitrary toll collection by private authorities. These legal reforms remove the regulatory foundations that enabled castle owners to generate revenue from transportation control, making fortress communities economically unviable even when they retain physical control over traditional routes. The technological innovations in vehicle design create transportation capabilities that prove incompatible with traditional castle-controlled route systems. You witness the development of larger wagons, improved harness systems, and specialized cargo vehicles that require wider roads and gentler grades than medieval transportation networks provide. These technological improvements work best on purpose-built transportation infrastructure, rather than the narrow, defensive-oriented passages that characterize castle-controlled routes, creating technical pressures that favor new transportation networks over traditional medieval systems. The international trade expansion that accompanies transportation improvements creates commercial relationships that operate on scales incompatible with local castle-based route control systems. You observe how transcontinental commerce requires standardized, efficient transportation networks that cannot accommodate the local variations and arbitrary controls characteristic of medieval fortress communities. The international commercial relationships that drive economic growth in this period demand transportation reliability and predictability that castle-controlled routes cannot provide. The insurance and financing systems that develop around improved transportation create risk management approaches that work better with standardized, well-maintained transportation networks than with medieval route systems subject to local castle authority variations. You witness how commercial insurance companies offer better terms for cargo shipped over improved highways and canal systems than for goods transported through traditional castle-controlled routes. These financial advantages create additional economic incentives for avoiding fortress communities in favor of modern transportation networks. The passenger service improvements that emerge from transportation development create travel options that prove superior to traditional arrangements dependent on castle-based hospitality. You notice how scheduled coaching services, canal packet boats, and improved inn networks provide travellers with comfort, security, and predictability that surpass anything available through medieval travel systems. These service improvements attract passenger traffic away from traditional routes, while demonstrating the obsolescence of castle-based travel accommodation systems. The urban development patterns that accompany transportation improvements create new commercial centres located along improved routes, rather than traditional castle-controlled highways. You observe how market towns, manufacturing centres, and commercial hubs develop at strategic points along canals, turnpike roads, and improved river systems rather than around existing castle communities. These new urban centres offer better access to transportation networks, creating economic opportunities that draw population and commerce away from fortress regions. The administrative efficiency gains that result from transportation improvements enable central governments to manage territories more effectively without relying on local, castle-based administrative systems. You witness how improved transportation enables royal officials, the tax collectors, and judicial authorities to reach remote regions directly rather than working through local fortress-based intermediaries. These administrative improvements reduce governmental dependence on castle communities while demonstrating the efficiency advantages of centralized administrative systems supported by modern transportation networks. As this transportation revolution reaches completion, you recognize that the new networks have fundamentally altered the economic geography of Europe in ways that make castle communities obsolete. The commercial arteries that now carry the continent's trade and travel flow through routes chosen for efficiency rather than defense, leaving the great fortresses as isolated islands bypassed by the currents of modern commerce. The age of castle-controlled transportation ends not in conquest but in the quiet opening of better roads that simply lead around rather than through the ancient strongholds. You observe the inexorable flow of populations toward emerging commercial cities as Europe's economic centre of gravity shifts from rural castle communities to urban commercial centres. The year is 1750, and you watch families loading their belongings onto carts, abandoning villages that have existed in the shadow of great castles for centuries. This migration represents more than simple relocation. It marks the fundamental transformation of the European civilization from a rural, castle-centered society to an urban, commercially oriented culture that has no need for fortress communities and the feudal relationships they represent. The growth of commercial cities creates unprecedented economic opportunities that dwarf anything available in traditional castle-dependent rural communities. You witness how cities like London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Hamburg develop into massive economic engines that generate wealth through international trade, manufacturing, and financial services. These urban centres offer employment opportunities, educational resources, and social mobility that castle communities cannot match, creating irresistible attraction for ambitious individuals seeking to improve their circumstances. The concentration of opportunity in cities makes rural castle regions appear economically stagnant by comparison. The guild system development in commercial cities provides structured career advancement opportunities that prove far superior to the limited economic roles available in castle-centered rural communities. You observe how urban craft guilds, merchant associations, and professional organizations create pathways for skill development and economic advancement that simply don't exist in fortress-dominated agricultural regions. Young people who might historically have spent their entire lives as peasants serving castle communities discover that urban employment offers possibilities for prosperity and social advancement that their rural birthplaces cannot provide. The banking and credit systems that emerge in commercial cities create financial capabilities that enable individuals to accumulate wealth and invest in business opportunities impossible to pursue in traditional castle communities. You witness the development of sophisticated financial instruments, insurance systems, and investment opportunities that require the concentrated economic activity found only in major urban centres. These financial innovations enable people to build wealth through commercial activity rather than dependence on agricultural production and feudal relationships associated with castle communities. Historians still argue whether urban migration represents natural economic evolution or deliberate policy efforts to concentrate population in locations more easily controlled by central governments. You notice how royal policies often encourage urban development while simultaneously restricting rural development that might strengthen local noble authority based in castle communities. The systematic nature of urban growth across multiple kingdoms suggests coordinated efforts to transform European society from feudal to commercial organisation patterns. The educational opportunities available in commercial cities provide intellectual development possibilities that castle communities cannot match due to their small populations and limited resources. You observe how cities develop universities, libraries, professional schools, and cultural institutions that offer educational advancement impossible to achieve in rural fortress regions. The concentration of intellectual resources in urban centres creates knowledge networks that accelerate innovation and cultural development while leaving castle communities increasingly isolated from educational progress. The religious institutions that flourish in commercial cities provide spiritual communities and social services that often surpass what castle communities can offer through their small local churches and occasional monastic connections. You witness how urban religious communities develop elaborate charitable systems, educational programs, and spiritual resources that serve larger populations more effectively than rural religious institutions. The urban religious experience often proves more intellectually sophisticated and socially supportive than rural castle-based spiritual communities. Quirky aspects of urban migration reveal the creative ways that people adapt to city life after abandoning rural castle communities. Some migrants establish neighbourhood associations based on their common origins in particular castle regions, creating urban communities that maintain rural connections while enjoying urban opportunities. Others completely reinvent their identities, abandoning rural names and occupational descriptions associated with castle communities in favour of urban professional identities. The most successful migrants often develop a specialisation in urban trades that utilise skills learned in rural castle environments, but apply them to commercial rather than feudal economic relationships. The manufacturing development that concentrates in commercial cities creates industrial employment opportunities that prove economically superior to agricultural labour associated with castle communities. You observe how urban workshops, textile production, and craft manufacturing generate wages that exceed agricultural income while offering more predictable employment than farming activities subject to weather and seasonal variations. The industrial work available in cities often requires skills that rural people possess, but applies them to commercial production rather than subsistence agriculture or service to feudal lords. The social mobility possibilities available in commercial cities represent perhaps the most powerful attraction drawing people away from castle communities where social positions remain largely fixed by birth and feudal relationships. You witness how urban commercial society enables individuals to improve their social status through economic success, professional achievement, or educational advancement rather than remaining permanently trapped in the social roles determined by their relationships to castle-based noble authorities. The urban social structure proves more fluid and merit-based than rural feudal systems. The entertainment and cultural opportunities that develop in commercial cities provide lifestyle advantages that castle communities cannot match due to their small populations and limited resources. You observe how cities support theatres, festivals, markets, and social gatherings that offer cultural enrichment and entertainment options impossible to achieve in isolated rural fortress communities. The urban cultural life proves more varied and intellectually stimulating than rural entertainment traditionally available around castle communities. The marriage and family formation opportunities available in commercial cities provide social advantages that prove particularly attractive to young people from castle communities. You notice how cities offer larger populations that enable individuals to find marriage partners with compatible interests, compatible social backgrounds, or superior economic prospects rather than being limited to the small pools of potential partners available in rural castle regions. The expanded social networks available in urban centres create family formation opportunities that rural communities cannot provide. The legal and judicial systems that operate in commercial cities often provide better protection for individual rights and commercial interests than traditional feudal legal systems associated with castle communities. You witness how urban legal systems develop commercial law, property rights protections, and dispute resolution mechanisms that serve commercial society more effectively than feudal legal traditions. The legal advantages of urban residence often prove crucial for individuals seeking to accumulate wealth or engage in commercial activities that might conflict with feudal obligations in castle communities. The transportation advantages that cities enjoy due to their strategic locations along improved road networks, canal systems, and river routes make urban residence economically advantageous for individuals engaged in trade or commercial activities. You observe how urban locations provide superior access to markets, suppliers, and customers compared to isolated castle communities that lack good transportation connections. The logistical advantages of urban residence often determine economic success for individuals engaged in commercial rather than agricultural activities. The health and medical services available in commercial cities provide practical advantages that prove particularly important for urban residents engaged in industrial or commercial work. You notice how cities develop professional medical services, hospitals, and public health systems that offer superior healthcare compared to rural regions dependent on traditional remedies and occasional visits from travelling physicians. The health advantages of urban residence often prove crucial for individuals seeking to maintain productive careers in commercial rather than agricultural activities. The political participation opportunities that emerge in commercial cities provide civic engagement possibilities that castle communities cannot offer due to their feudal political organisation. You witness how urban political systems enable merchant participation in municipal governance, guild representation in civic decisions, and citizen involvement in local administration that proves impossible under feudal systems where political authority remains concentrated in noble castle owners. The political empowerment available in cities attracts individuals seeking influence over their own governance. The information and communication networks that operate through commercial cities provide access to knowledge and news that castle communities cannot match due to their isolation and limited connections to broader communication systems. You observe how cities serve as information hubs that connect local communities to national and international news networks while providing access to printed materials, correspondence networks, and intellectual discussions impossible to maintain in isolated rural fortress communities. As this urban migration reaches its peak, you recognise that the demographic foundation of castle civilization has been permanently undermined. The human communities that once sustained fortress life have discovered better alternatives in the bustling commercial cities that represent Europe's economic future. The great castles stand increasingly empty, their purpose exhausted not by military defeat, but by the simple fact that people have found more promising places to build their lives. You feel the earth tremble beneath your feet as a devastating earthquake strikes the Rhine Valley in 1755, watching in horror as castle walls that have stood for 6 centuries crack and crumble within minutes. The ancient stones, weakened by centuries of freeze-thaw cycles and natural settling, cannot withstand the violent shaking that topples towers and splits massive curtain walls like eggshells. This natural disaster represents just one episode in an ongoing assault by elemental forces that proves more destructive to European castles than any human army ever assembled. Nature, patient and relentless, begins reclaiming the stone monuments that humanity built to defy time itself. The geological instability that affects many castle regions creates ongoing structural challenges that prove increasingly expensive to address, as maintenance resources become scarce. You observe how castles built on limestone foundations suffer from gradual subsidence as underground water systems erode the bedrock beneath massive stone structures. The weight of castle walls and towers, distributed across foundation systems designed centuries earlier, creates stress patterns that exceed the engineering tolerances of medieval construction techniques. As these geological processes accelerate, castle owners face repair costs that often exceed the value of the properties themselves. The flood cycles that sweep across Europe during this period inflict catastrophic damage on castles located in river valleys and coastal regions. You witness the great floods of 1717 that devastate castle communities along major river systems, with water levels rising higher than the ground floors of structures that had never previously experienced serious flood damage. The hydraulic force of flood waters undermines foundation stones, erodes mortar joints, and deposits debris that creates ongoing maintenance challenges for castle owners already struggling with limited resources. The climate changes occurring during the Little Ice Age create environmental stresses that accelerate castle deterioration throughout northern Europe. You observe how extended periods of severe cold create freeze-thaw cycles that prove particularly destructive to medieval masonry construction. Water penetrates tiny cracks in stone and mortar during autumn rains, then expands during winter freezing, creating hydraulic pressure that splits even the most solid construction. These climate-related damage patterns prove cumulative, with each winter season creating additional structural problems that compound existing maintenance challenges. Historians still argue whether natural disasters represent random events that coincidentally affect abandoned castles, or whether human neglect makes castle structures more vulnerable to environmental damage than properly maintained buildings would be. You notice how well-maintained castles often survive natural disasters that completely destroy neglected structures, suggesting that the combination of natural forces and human abandonment creates particularly destructive synergies that neither factor alone would produce. The lightning strikes that frequently target castle towers create fire damage that proves devastating to structures containing centuries of accumulated wooden construction elements. You witness how lightning-induced fires spread rapidly through castle interiors that contain massive timber frameworks. Wooden floors and combustible furnishings accumulated over generations of occupation. The isolated locations of many castles make fire suppression difficult or impossible, allowing lightning fires to consume interior structures while leaving only empty stone shells that lack the internal frameworks necessary for continued human habitation. The wind damage that affects castle structures creates ongoing maintenance challenges that prove particularly expensive to address. You observe how the exposed hilltop locations chosen for defensive advantages make castles vulnerable to severe windstorms that can remove roof systems, topple weakened walls, and create structural damage requiring immediate repair to prevent further deterioration. The cost of replacing storm-damaged roofing, windows, and defensive structures often exceeds available maintenance budgets, leading to temporary repairs that prove inadequate for long-term structural preservation. Quirky natural phenomena reveal unexpected ways that environmental forces contribute to castle abandonment. Some castles experience unusual settling patterns that cause structures to lean at dangerous angles, creating buildings that remain technically inhabitable but psychologically uncomfortable for residents who fear imminent collapse. Others develop persistent drainage problems that create dampness and humidity levels incompatible with healthy human habitation. despite the buildings remaining structurally sound. The most bizarre natural disasters involve sinkholes that open beneath castle foundations, creating sudden structural collapses that occur without warning or obvious previous damage. The pest infestations that affect castle structures create biological damage that proves particularly difficult and expensive to redress. You witness how wood-boring insects systematically destroy the timber frameworks that support castle floors, roofs, and interior structures. The massive timbers used in medieval construction provide ideal breeding environments for insects that can remain undetected for years while causing structural damage that only becomes apparent when major building elements suddenly fail. The cost of treating pest infestations and replacing damaged timber often exceeds the resources available to castle owners facing multiple maintenance challenges. The vegetation growth that affects abandoned castle structures creates ongoing damage that accelerates structural deterioration while making properties appear increasingly derelict. You observe how ivy, tree roots, and other plants penetrate cracks in stone walls, gradually widening gaps and undermining structural stability. The romantic appearance of vegetation-covered ruins often conceals serious structural damage caused by root systems that can split massive stones and destroy carefully constructed masonry joints. Managing vegetation growth around castle structures requires constant attention that proves expensive and labour-intensive. The water damage that affects castle structures creates persistent problems that prove particularly difficult to resolve using medieval construction techniques. You notice how inadequate drainage systems designed for different climate conditions prove unable to handle changing precipitation patterns that accompany climate fluctuations. Water infiltration through walls and roof systems creates interior dampness that damages furnishings, promotes wood rot, and creates unhealthy living conditions that make castle habitation unpleasant, even when structures remain technically habitable. The animal damage that affects castle structures creates unexpected maintenance challenges that prove surprisingly costly to address. You witness how bats, birds, and rodents establish colonies within castle walls and towers, creating sanitation problems while causing structural damage through their nesting activities. Large animals like cattle and horses can cause significant damage to castle structures when they seek shelter during storms, while smaller animals create ongoing problems by gnawing wooden elements and nesting in wall cavities. The chemical deterioration that affects stone construction creates gradual damage that proves difficult to detect until structural problems become severe. You observe how air pollution from increasing industrial activities combines with natural weathering to create chemical reactions that gradually dissolve limestone and sandstone construction materials. This chemical weathering proves particularly problematic for decorative stonework and carved elements that require precise dimensions to maintain their structural and aesthetic functions. The thermal expansion and contraction cycles that affect castle structures create stress patterns that gradually weaken even the most solid construction over time. You witness how daily and seasonal temperature variations cause massive stone structures to expand and contract at different rates, creating internal stresses that gradually loosen mortar joints and crack structural elements. These thermal stresses prove particularly problematic for large structures with complex geometries that create uneven expansion patterns throughout the building system. The soil erosion that affects castle foundation systems creates gradual undermining that can eventually threaten entire structures. You notice how change in agricultural practices, deforestation, and altered drainage patterns modify soil stability around castle foundations that were designed for different environmental conditions. The gradual erosion of supporting soil creates foundation settlement that can cause structural damage ranging from minor cracking to complete building collapse. The ice damage that affects castle structures during severe winter weather creates particular challenges for buildings designed before the climate changes associated with the Little Ice Age. You observe how ice formation in gutters, downspouts, and drainage systems creates water backup that forces moisture into wall systems not designed to handle such infiltration. The weight of ice accumulation on roof systems can exceed the load-bearing capacity of medieval timber frameworks, creating structural failures that require immediate attention to prevent further damage. The seismic activity that affects many European regions creates ongoing structural challenges that prove particularly problematic for tall, massive castle structures. You witness how even minor earthquakes can cause significant damage to buildings with high centres of gravity and limited structural flexibility. The rigid construction techniques used in medieval castle building prove poorly adapted to handle seismic stresses that create failure patterns different from the military threats that original designers anticipated. As these natural forces continue their relentless assault on castle structures throughout Europe, you recognise that time itself has become the ultimate besieger of these stone monuments. The elements that seemed so permanent when human hands first placed them have proven vulnerable to forces that operate on geological rather than human timescales. The great castles fall not to human enemies but to the patient, persistent power of nature reclaiming the materials that humanity borrowed to build dreams of permanence in stone. You observe the systematic dismantling of abandoned castles as local builders discover that centuries-old fortifications provide the finest construction materials available in their regions. The year is 1780, and you watch stonemasons carefully removing dressed stones from crumbling castle walls, their centuries-old mortar giving way under careful chiselling to reveal limestone blocks that surpass anything available from contemporary quarries. This practical recycling of castle materials accelerates throughout the 18th and 19th centuries as growing populations need building materials, while economic pragmatism overcomes romantic sentiment about preserving medieval ruins. The quality of castle construction materials makes these ancient structures irresistible sources for builders seeking superior stone for new construction projects. You witness how castle builders selected the finest limestone, sandstone, and granite available in their regions, often transporting materials over considerable distances to ensure optimal construction quality. The stones used in major castle construction prove superior to materials available from local quarries that have been worked for centuries, making abandoned fortifications treasure troves of premium building materials that command high prices in construction markets. The transportation costs that historically made castle construction so expensive now work in reverse to make castle dismantling economically attractive for local builders. You observe how the massive effort required to transport quality stone to remote castle locations centuries earlier means that builders can now access premium materials without the expense of long-distance hauling from distant quarries. The stone needed for building a parish church or manor house can be obtained by dismantling a nearby castle ruin, eliminating transportation costs that would make using fresh quarry stone economically prohibitive. The technical expertise required for stone quarrying makes castle dismantling an attractive alternative for builders who lack the specialized knowledge needed to extract stone from natural quarries. You witness how dismantling castle walls requires masonry skills that local craftsmen possess, while opening new quarries demands geological knowledge, specialized equipment, and substantial capital investment. The systematic removal of castle stones provides employment for stonemasons during periods when new castle construction has virtually ceased, creating economic incentives that accelerate fortress dismantling. Historians still argue whether stone quarrying from castle ruins represents opportunistic recycling of abandoned materials or deliberate efforts to eliminate symbols of feudal authority that conflict with emerging democratic and nationalist ideologies. You notice how castle dismantling often accelerates during periods of political change, when local populations seek to assert independence from traditional noble authority. The systematic nature of castle destruction in some regions suggests coordinated efforts to eliminate feudal symbols rather than random material scavenging. The building boom that accompanies population growth and economic development creates enormous demand for construction materials that abandoned castles can supply more economically than alternative sources. You observe how expanding towns and villages need stone for churches, public buildings, bridges, and private residences that exceed the capacity of local quarries to supply. Castle ruins provide immediately available sources of dressed stone that can be recycled into new construction projects without the time delays and capital investment required to develop new quarry operations. The legal frameworks governing property abandonment often make castle stone legally available to local communities when fortress owners can no longer maintain their properties or pay associated taxes. You witness how local authorities acquire abandoned castle properties through tax foreclosure procedures, then authorize stone removal to generate revenue for municipal projects or to eliminate dangerous ruins that pose public safety hazards. These legal mechanisms provide official authorization for castle dismantling while generating public revenues from material sales. Quirky examples of castle stone recycling reveal the creative ways that medieval materials find new purposes in later construction projects. Some dismantled castles provide stone for railroad construction, with ancient fortress walls transformed into railway embankments and bridge foundations that serve industrial transportation needs. Others become sources for canal construction materials, their defensive stones repurposed to create commercial waterway infrastructure. The most unusual recycling involves grinding castle stones into lime for agricultural use, converting military fortifications into soil improvement materials for peaceful farming activities. The specialized tools and techniques developed for castle dismantling create cottage industries that focus specifically on salvaging materials from abandoned medieval structures. You observe how professional stone salvagers develop expertise in identifying valuable materials, removing stones without damage, and sorting reclaimed materials by quality and intended use. These specialists often work systematically through castle ruins, creating organized demolition processes that maximize material recovery while minimizing waste. The regional variations in castle stone recycling reveal different economic pressures and cultural attitudes toward medieval heritage preservation. You notice how regions with abundant local stone sources prove less likely to dismantle castle ruins, while areas with limited quarry resources systematically strip abandoned fortifications for building materials. The economic necessity that drives castle dismantling proves stronger in regions where alternative building materials remain expensive or difficult to obtain. The documentation that accompanies systematic castle dismantling reveals the enormous quantities of materials that major fortifications contained. You witness how inventories of dismantled castles record thousands of tons of dressed stone, hundreds of carved architectural elements, and massive quantities of specialized materials like window tracery and decorative sculptures. The sheer volume of materials available from single castle dismantling projects often supplies entire regional construction industries for years or even decades. The architectural elements that prove most valuable in castle dismantling operations include decorative stones, carved capitals, window frames, and specialized construction materials that would be impossible to reproduce economically using contemporary techniques. You observe how dismantling operations often focus on these high-value architectural elements that command premium prices from builders seeking to incorporate medieval craftsmanship into new construction projects. The artistic quality of medieval stone carving makes castle architectural elements particularly desirable for church construction and prestigious residential projects. The environmental considerations that accompany castle dismantling create unexpected benefits for local ecosystems, as removal of massive stone structures enables natural vegetation patterns to re-establish themselves in areas that had been artificially modified for defensive purposes. You observe how dismantling castle walls allows natural drainage patterns to resume, eliminating the artificial water retention and soil compaction that fortress construction had created. The stone removal process often improves agricultural productivity by eliminating obstacles to ploughing and irrigation while providing cleared land suitable for expanded farming operations. The social implications of castle stone recycling create interesting dynamics within local communities as the dismantling process provides employment opportunities while simultaneously erasing symbols of historical social hierarchy. You witness how stone salvage operations employ significant numbers of local workers during periods when alternative employment may be scarce, creating economic benefits that help communities transition from feudal to commercial economic relationships. The collaborative nature of castle dismantling projects often strengthens community solidarity by requiring coordinated efforts that transcend traditional social divisions. The preservation conflicts that emerge around castle dismantling reveal growing tensions between practical economic needs and emerging historical preservation sensibilities. You notice how educated individuals increasingly object to castle destruction, while local populations continue viewing abandoned fortifications primarily as sources of valuable building materials. These conflicts intensify throughout the 18th and 19th centuries as Romantic movement intellectuals develop appreciation for medieval architecture, while practical builders continue prioritizing material utility over historical significance. The technological innovations that develop around stone salvage operations create specialized equipment and techniques that prove useful for construction projects beyond castle dismantling. You observe how workers develop improved methods for removing mortar, lifting heavy stones, and transporting reclaimed materials that enhance general construction capabilities throughout affected regions. The technical knowledge accumulated through castle dismantling projects contributes to improved construction techniques that benefit entire regional building industries. The market systems that develop around castle stone sales create commercial networks that connect salvage operations with construction projects across wide geographic areas. You witness how stone dealers establish businesses focused specifically on reclaimed medieval materials, creating distribution systems that enable castle stones to find markets in regions far from their original locations. These commercial relationships often prove more profitable in local construction use, creating economic incentives that accelerate systematic castle dismantling. The quality control issues that affect castle stone recycling create challenges for builders attempting to use medieval materials in new construction projects. You notice how stones removed from castle walls may suffer damage during dismantling operations, while mortar removal processes can weaken or crack materials that appeared sound while still in place. The variable quality of reclaimed materials requires careful sorting and testing that adds complexity to construction projects using castle stone. The seasonal patterns that affect castle dismantling operations create rhythmic cycles of destruction that coordinate with agricultural and construction schedules throughout affected regions. You observe how stone removal typically occurs during winter months, when agricultural demands are minimal and construction workers need employment, creating annual cycles of castle destruction that gradually reduce fortress ruins to ground level over periods of several years or decades. The legal disputes that sometimes arise around castle stone ownership create complex property law cases that help establish precedents for historic preservation and salvage rights. You witness how unclear ownership of abandoned properties leads to conflicts between traditional noble families, local authorities, and commercial salvage operations, with resolution of these disputes influencing future policies regarding treatment of historic properties. These legal precedents often favour practical use over preservation, accelerating castle dismantling throughout many regions. The international trade that develops around high-quality castle stones creates export markets that extend the geographic reach of castle dismantling operations. You notice how particularly fine architectural elements from dismantled castles find buyers in distant countries where medieval materials command premium prices for prestigious construction projects. This international demand creates additional economic incentives for systematic castle destruction, while spreading medieval European architectural elements across wider geographic areas. The documentation practices that accompany systematic castle dismantling reveal interesting approaches to recording architectural information before destruction occurs. You observe how some dismantling operations create detailed drawings and measurements of castle structures before removal begins, preserving architectural knowledge even when physical structures are destroyed. These documentation efforts represent early examples of architectural recording that anticipate later historic preservation methodologies. The industrial applications that emerge for castle stone materials create new markets that extend beyond traditional construction uses. You witness how castle stones prove suitable for industrial purposes like furnace construction, railroad ballast, and harbour improvement projects that require large quantities of durable stone materials. These industrial applications often consume entire castle ruins more rapidly than traditional construction recycling, accelerating the pace of fortress disappearance throughout industrial regions. The environmental impact of castle stone removal creates lasting changes to local landscapes that extend far beyond the elimination of medieval structures. You notice how systematic stone removal often involves earth moving and site preparation that modifies topography, drainage patterns, and soil conditions in ways that affect local agriculture and natural systems for generations. The landscape changes that accompany castle dismantling often prove more significant than the original fortress construction in terms of environmental modification. The cultural significance of castle stone recycling creates symbolic transformations that reflect changing social values and political relationships within European societies. You observe how the physical destruction of castle walls parallels the elimination of feudal social relationships, with stone recycling projects serving as practical expressions of democratic and egalitarian values that reject aristocratic privilege. The transformation of fortress materials into churches, schools, and public buildings represents symbolic conversion of military authority into civilian social infrastructure. As this systematic recycling of castle materials reaches its peak, you recognize that entire fortress civilizations are being literally deconstructed stone by stone and integrated into the fabric of modern European society. The great walls that once divided rulers from ruled now form the foundations of democratic institutions, while the towers that symbolize noble privilege become the building blocks of commercial prosperity. The medieval castle dies not in battle but in the quiet work of countless masons who transform monuments to feudalism into materials for a more egalitarian future. You witness the emergence of complex legal battles that engulf abandoned castle properties as multiple parties claim ownership rights to fortifications whose noble families have died out, fled, or lost their legal standing through political upheaval. The year is 1820, and you observe lawyers poring over centuries-old documents in dimly lit archives, searching for evidence that might establish legitimate claims to castle properties worth vast sums as potential building material sources, but worthless as maintained residences. These inheritance disputes create legal quagmires that can last for decades, leaving castle properties in limbo where no party wants to invest in maintenance for structures that might ultimately belong to someone else. The complexity of medieval inheritance law creates particularly challenging problems for determining castle ownership when traditional family lines become extinct or politically compromised. You examine legal documents that reveal how castle ownership often depended on feudal relationships, marriage agreements, and political appointments that lose their legal validity when political systems change or noble families face accusations of treason. The interweaving of personal property rights with political authority that characterized medieval law creates legal puzzles that prove almost impossible to resolve using modern legal frameworks. The documentary evidence required to establish legitimate castle ownership often proves impossible to locate or authenticate after centuries of political upheaval, warfare, and administrative changes. You observe how crucial legal documents may have been destroyed during wars, lost through neglect, or deliberately concealed by parties seeking to avoid legal obligations. The absence of reliable documentation leaves many castle properties in legal limbo where competing claimants can present plausible but unprovable ownership arguments that courts cannot definitively resolve. The international complications that arise when castle properties involve claims from multiple countries create diplomatic issues that extend far beyond simple property law disputes. You witness how political boundary changes throughout European history leave some castles subject to ownership claims, governed by different national legal systems, with competing courts asserting jurisdiction over the same properties. These international legal conflicts often prove impossible to resolve through normal judicial procedures, creating permanent uncertainty about castle ownership that prevents proper maintenance or development. Historians still argue whether inheritance disputes represent genuine legal complexities arising from medieval property law, or deliberate strategies by various parties to prevent castle development that might benefit their competitors. You notice how some legal challenges appear to be initiated primarily to create delays and complications, rather than to establish legitimate ownership claims. The strategic use of legal procedures to prevent resolution of property disputes suggests that some parties prefer legal uncertainty to clear ownership that might benefit their opponents. The cost of pursuing legal claims to castle ownership often exceeds the potential value of the properties themselves, creating economic disincentives that discourage resolution of ownership disputes. You observe how legal fees, court costs, and expert witness expenses associated with complex inheritance cases can consume resources equivalent to the value of entire castle properties. Potential claimants often discover that pursuing their legal rights would cost more than the properties are worth, leading them to abandon legitimate claims rather than invest in expensive litigation. The time delays inherent in complex property litigation create additional problems for castle preservation, as legal disputes can continue for decades while the physical structures deteriorate beyond repair. You witness how court proceedings that begin with disputes over valuable properties often conclude years later with judgments regarding worthless ruins that have collapsed during the litigation period. The irony of legal systems that protect property rights while allowing the properties themselves to be destroyed through neglect reveals fundamental contradictions in how legal procedures interact with preservation needs. Quirky examples of inheritance disputes reveal the bizarre complications that can arise when medieval property law meets modern legal systems. Some castle ownership disputes involve claims based on obscure feudal obligations that technically remain legally valid, but have no practical relevance to contemporary society. Others feature competing inheritance claims from distant relatives who discover their potential castle ownership only after genealogical research reveals previously unknown family connections. The most complex cases involve properties where ownership depends on fulfilling medieval military service obligations that no longer exist or make sense in modern contexts. The fraudulent claims that sometimes emerge during castle inheritance disputes create additional complications that courts must resolve while determining legitimate ownership rights. You observe how the potential value of castle properties as sources of building materials creates incentives for fraudulent documentation and false genealogical claims designed to establish ownership rights. The difficulty of authenticating centuries-old documents and verifying genealogical relationships creates opportunities for fraud that further complicate legitimate legal proceedings. The political implications of castle ownership disputes often influence legal proceedings in ways that prioritize political considerations over strict application of property law. You notice how courts may favor ownership claims that support current political arrangements while rejecting claims that might strengthen opposition political factions. The intersection of property law with political considerations creates additional uncertainty about legal outcomes that discourages investment in castle properties regardless of apparent ownership rights. The administrative challenges that courts face when dealing with castle inheritance disputes reveal the limitations of legal systems designed for contemporary property rather than medieval fortress ownership. You witness how judges struggle to apply modern legal principles to property relationships that developed under completely different political and social systems. The lack of legal precedents for resolving medieval property disputes using contemporary legal frameworks creates uncertainty that affects all parties involved in castle ownership litigation. The expert testimony required for castle inheritance cases creates specialized professional niches for historians, genealogists, and legal scholars who develop expertise in medieval property law and feudal inheritance systems. You observe how these specialists command high fees for their expert testimony, while often reaching conflicting conclusions about the same historical evidence. The dependence on expert interpretation of ambiguous historical evidence creates additional sources of uncertainty and expense in castle ownership litigation. The insurance and financing complications that affect castle properties subject to ownership disputes make these structures particularly difficult to maintain or develop even when parties might be willing to invest in preservation efforts. You notice how insurance companies refuse to provide coverage for properties with unclear ownership, while banks decline to provide financing for improvement projects that might benefit disputed properties. These financial constraints make castle maintenance practically impossible regardless of the good intentions of potential caretakers. The taxation issues that arise around disputed castle properties create additional administrative complications that affect both government revenues and property maintenance decisions. You witness how local tax authorities struggle to determine who should pay property taxes on disputed castles, often resulting in tax liens that create additional claims against already complicated properties. The accumulation of unpaid taxes during lengthy legal proceedings often exceeds the value of castle properties, making resolution of ownership disputes economically pointless. The public interest considerations that emerge during castle inheritance disputes reveal tensions between private property rights and community interest in preserving historic structures. You observe how local communities may support ownership claimants who promise to preserve castle ruins, while opposing claimants who plan to dismantle structures for building materials. These community preferences sometimes influence legal proceedings in ways that complicate strict application of property law principles. The archaeological implications of castle ownership disputes create additional complications when legal proceedings must address discoveries of historical artifacts or architectural features that emerge during property investigations. You notice how archaeological evidence sometimes supports particular ownership claims while contradicting others, creating new sources of evidence that can either clarify or further complicate legal proceedings. The intersection of archaeological research with legal proceedings adds temporal dimensions to castle ownership disputes, as new discoveries can emerge years or decades after initial legal proceedings begin. The environmental factors that affect disputed castle properties during lengthy legal proceedings create deterioration problems that reduce property values while legal battles continue. You witness how properties left unmaintained during ownership disputes suffer accelerated deterioration from weather damage, vegetation growth, and structural failure that would be prevented through proper care. The environmental damage that occurs during legal proceedings often makes resolution of ownership disputes moot by eliminating the properties that originally prompted the litigation. The mediation attempts that sometimes emerge to resolve complex castle inheritance disputes reveal alternative approaches to addressing property conflicts that courts cannot easily resolve through traditional legal procedures. You observe how mediation proceedings may achieve practical resolutions that enable property maintenance and development even when ownership questions cannot be definitively resolved. These alternative dispute resolution approaches sometimes prove more effective than formal legal proceedings for preserving castle structures while accommodating multiple stakeholder interests. As these legal complexities continue multiplying around castle properties throughout Europe, you recognize that the law itself has become another force contributing to fortress abandonment. The legal systems designed to protect property rights have created procedural obstacles that make castle ownership more liability than asset, leaving ancient strongholds trapped in juridical limbo while they crumble toward ruin. The medieval dream of building for eternity founders on the reef of modern legal complexity that no castle builder could have anticipated. You observe the emergence of a remarkable cultural transformation as educated Europeans begin celebrating castle ruins rather than lamenting their decay, embracing the romantic beauty of crumbling walls covered in ivy and broken towers silhouetted against dramatic skies. The year is 1790, and you witness poets like William Wordsworth composing verses inspired by ruined castles, while painters like Caspar David Friedrich create haunting landscapes where human figures contemplate the sublime melancholy of fortress decay. This romantic movement fundamentally alters how society perceives castle ruins, transforming them from symbols of failure into objects of aesthetic appreciation that should be preserved in their ruined state rather than restored to original condition. The philosophical foundations of Romanticism create intellectual frameworks that find profound beauty and meaning in decay, impermanence, and the victory of nature over human ambition. You witness how romantic thinkers like Edmund Burke develop theories of the sublime that identify aesthetic pleasure in contemplating destruction, ruins, and the passage of time. These philosophical developments make castle ruins appear more artistically valuable than maintained fortifications, creating cultural pressure to preserve decay rather than prevent it. The romantic appreciation for ruins represents a complete reversal of traditional attitudes that viewed castle maintenance as moral obligation. The literary movement that embraces ruined castles creates popular culture that celebrates fortress decay as romantically superior to preservation efforts. You observe how Gothic novels by authors like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe use castle ruins as atmospheric settings that enhance their mysterious and melancholic narratives. The popularity of Gothic literature creates public demand for picturesque castle ruins that can provide suitable backdrops for romantic adventures and mysterious encounters. This literary fashion makes castle decay culturally fashionable rather than socially embarrassing. The artistic movement that focuses on landscape painting discovers in castle ruins perfect subjects that combine human history with natural beauty in ways that appeal to romantic aesthetic sensibilities. You witness how artists develop techniques for depicting the interplay between ruined architecture and natural vegetation that makes castle decay appear more beautiful than original construction. The popularity of ruin painting creates art markets that value castle decay as aesthetic subject matter, providing economic incentives for preserving ruins in their decayed state rather than pursuing restoration. Historians still argue whether romantic appreciation for castle ruins represents genuine aesthetic innovation or convenient rationalization for accepting decay that society cannot afford to prevent. You notice how romantic ruin appreciation emerges during periods when castle maintenance proves economically impossible for most property owners, suggesting that aesthetic theories may develop partly to make virtue of practical necessity. The timing of romantic movement coincides suspiciously with the period when castle abandonment reaches peak levels throughout Europe. The tourism industry that develops around picturesque castle ruins creates economic incentives for preserving decay rather than pursuing restoration that might eliminate the romantic atmosphere that attracts visitors. You observe how entrepreneurs establish coaching routes, guidebooks, and accommodation services that cater to travellers seeking to experience the sublime melancholy of ruined castles. This romantic tourism proves more profitable than traditional castle-based hospitality, creating economic justification for maintaining ruins in their decayed condition, rather than investing in structural restoration. The garden design movement that emerges during the Romantic period incorporates artificial ruins into landscape architecture, creating fake castle decay in locations where natural ruins are unavailable. You witness how wealthy landowners construct artificial ruins designed to provide romantic atmosphere and contemplative settings within their estate landscapes. The popularity of artificial ruins demonstrates how thoroughly cultural attitudes toward castle decay have transformed, with property owners now paying to create the appearance of fortress abandonment rather than working to prevent it. Quirky examples of romantic ruin appreciation reveal the extent to which cultural attitudes toward castle decay have been revolutionized. Some property owners deliberately accelerate castle deterioration by removing roof systems and encouraging vegetation growth to enhance the romantic appearance of their ruins. Others stage theatrical performances within castle ruins that celebrate the melancholic beauty of decay rather than mourning the loss of architectural heritage. The most extreme romantic enthusiasts purchase intact castles specifically to allow them to decay naturally while documenting the aesthetic transformation through paintings and poetry. The architectural theory that develops around romantic ruin appreciation creates intellectual justification for preferring decay over restoration in historic preservation approaches. You observe how theorists argue that ruins represent more authentic expressions of historical experience than restored buildings that eliminate evidence of temporal passage. This intellectual framework makes restoration appear to falsify history, while preservation of decay becomes historically accurate conservation practice. The theoretical preference for authentic decay over reconstructed completeness influences historic preservation practices for generations. The psychological aspects of romantic ruin appreciation reveal how contemplating castle decay provides emotional satisfaction that restored buildings cannot offer. You notice how romantic literature emphasizes the pleasurable melancholy that ruins inspire, suggesting that humans derive aesthetic and spiritual benefit from contemplating impermanence and the victory of time over human ambition. This psychological dimension of ruin appreciation makes castle decay emotionally valuable in ways that maintained structures cannot provide. The nationalist implications of romantic ruin appreciation create political dimensions that influence castle preservation policies throughout Europe. You witness how romantic nationalism uses ruined castles as symbols of ancient national greatness that inspire patriotic sentiment and cultural identity. The political usefulness of romantic castle ruins as nationalist symbols provides governmental support for ruin preservation that maintained castles might not receive. This nationalist dimension of ruin appreciation creates political constituency for castle preservation that focuses specifically on maintaining decay rather than pursuing restoration. The scientific interest that emerges around castle ruins during the Romantic period creates scholarly disciplines that study fortress decay as archaeologically and historically valuable phenomenon worthy of systematic investigation. You observe how antiquarians develop methodologies for documenting, measuring, and analysing castle ruins that treat decay as source of historical knowledge rather than obstacle to understanding. This scientific approach to ruin study provides intellectual justification for preservation that complements aesthetic arguments for maintaining castle decay. The photographic technology that emerges during the later Romantic period creates new artistic media particularly suited to documenting the atmospheric qualities of castle ruins that painters had previously struggled to capture accurately. You witness how early photographers discover that castle ruins provide ideal subjects for exploring the artistic potential of photography, while documenting historic structures for posterity. The photographic documentation of castle ruins creates visual records that preserve images of decay while potentially inspiring preservation efforts or restoration projects. The religious dimensions of romantic ruin appreciation create spiritual frameworks that find theological meaning in contemplating the impermanence of human achievements compared to divine eternity. You notice how Christian romantic thought interprets castle ruins as reminders of human vanity and the ultimate triumph of spiritual values over worldly power. This religious interpretation of ruin contemplation provides moral justification for appreciating decay while creating devotional practices centered around ruined architecture. The educational aspects of romantic ruin appreciation create pedagogical approaches that use castle decay to teach historical aesthetic, and moral lessons that maintained structures cannot provide. You observe how educators develop curricula that use castle ruins as teaching tools for discussing historical change, artistic beauty, and philosophical reflection on temporality. The educational value of ruins creates institutional support for preservation that emphasizes maintaining decay rather than eliminating it through restoration. The collecting practices that emerge around romantic ruin appreciation create markets for artifacts, artwork and documentation related to castle decay that provide economic incentives for preservation efforts. You witness how collectors develop enthusiasm for purchasing paintings, prints, sculptures, and architectural fragments that celebrate or commemorate castle ruins. This collecting market creates economic value for ruin-related cultural products that can support preservation activities. The international influence of romantic ruin appreciation spreads aesthetic theories developed around European castle ruins to other cultural contexts, where similar approaches to historic preservation become influential. You notice how romantic approaches to ruins influence preservation practices throughout regions where European cultural influence extends, creating international movements that prioritize authentic decay over reconstructed completeness in historic preservation practices. As this romantic transformation of attitudes toward castle decay reaches maturity, you recognize that European culture has developed entirely new relationships with architectural heritage that celebrate impermanence rather than permanence. The aesthetic revolution that finds beauty in decay has transformed castle ruins from symbols of failure into objects of cultural veneration that deserve preservation precisely because they embody the passage of time. The Romantic Age creates new forms of immortality for castles, not as maintained structures, but as beautiful ruins that inspire contemplation of time's ultimate victory over human ambition. You witness the profound indifference of Victorian society toward medieval castle preservation as industrial progress creates new forms of wealth and cultural prestige that make fortress heritage seem irrelevant to modern civilization. The year is 1850, and you observe railway engineers routing their lines directly through castle courtyards without considering historical significance, while factory owners establish industrial operations within ruined castle walls as convenient sources of cheap building space. This industrial era mentality views medieval fortifications as obstacles to progress rather than treasures to preserve, creating systematic neglect that accelerates castle decay throughout the period of Europe's greatest prosperity and technological capability. The Victorian obsession with industrial progress creates cultural values that prioritize technological advancement and economic development over historical preservation, making castle maintenance seem like wasteful sentimentality that diverts resources from productive investments. You observe how Victorian society measures civilization through industrial output, railway construction, and technological innovation rather than preservation of medieval architecture. The cultural emphasis on forward progress makes backwards-looking preservation activities appear reactionary and economically counterproductive. Castle ruins become symbols of outdated feudal systems that progressive society should transcend rather than preserve. The rapid urbanisation that characterises the Victorian era concentrates population and wealth in industrial cities, leaving rural castle regions economically marginalised and politically irrelevant to national development priorities. You witness how the demographic shift toward urban centres reduces the political constituency for rural castle preservation, while concentrating cultural influence among populations that view medieval fortifications as curiosities rather than heritage treasures. The urban focus of Victorian civilization makes rural castle preservation a low priority for governmental resources and public attention. The technological confidence that defines Victorian culture creates attitudes that view contemporary engineering achievements as superior to medieval construction, making castle preservation seem unnecessary when modern buildings can provide better functionality at lower cost. You observe how Victorian engineers develop construction techniques that surpass medieval capabilities in every measurable aspect except aesthetic character, creating cultural preference for modern over historic architecture. The technological superiority of Victorian construction makes castle preservation appear to celebrate inferior engineering rather than superior artistic achievement. Historians still argue whether Victorian neglect of castle preservation represents deliberate rejection of feudal heritage or natural consequence of rapid social change that overwhelms traditional preservation practices. You notice how Victorian preservation efforts focus on classical architecture and contemporary monuments, while systematically ignoring medieval fortifications, suggesting deliberate cultural choices rather than accidental neglect. The selective nature of Victorian preservation priorities indicates conscious decisions about which aspects of historical heritage deserve preservation resources. The economic priorities that drive Victorian development create systematic pressure to utilise castle properties for industrial purposes, rather than preservation activities that generate no measurable economic returns. You witness how castle courtyards become factory sites. Castle walls provide foundations for railway infrastructure, and castle stones supply materials for industrial construction projects. The economic logic of industrial development makes castle preservation appear wasteful, when fortress properties can contribute to productive economic activities that generate employment and taxation revenues. The educational systems that emerged during the Victorian era emphasise scientific, technical, and commercial knowledge, while minimising historical study that might create appreciation for medieval architecture and castle preservation needs. You observe how Victorian curricula prioritise practical skills and modern knowledge over historical learning that might inspire interest in preserving feudal heritage. The educational neglect of medieval history reduces public knowledge about castle significance, while creating cultural attitudes that view historical preservation as irrelevant to practical education needs. Quirky examples of Victorian attitudes toward castle properties reveal the extent to which industrial society views medieval fortifications as raw materials for modern development rather than heritage treasures worthy of preservation. Some Victorian entrepreneurs established tourist attractions within castle ruins that emphasise the primitive character of medieval life compared to modern civilization's superior comfort and convenience. Others use castle properties as sites for demonstrating industrial technologies that illustrate progress achieved since feudal times. The most dismissive Victorian approaches involve using castle ruins as convenient dumping grounds for industrial waste that gradually buries medieval remains beneath modern debris. The architectural fashion that dominates Victorian culture emphasises ornate decoration and technological display, rather than the simple, functional aesthetics that characterise medieval castle design, making fortress architecture appear austere and primitive compared to contemporary building styles. You witness how Victorian taste preferences favour elaborate ornamentation, modern materials, and technological innovation over the plain stone walls and military functionality that define castle architecture. This aesthetic incompatibility makes castle preservation seem to celebrate inferior artistic sensibilities rather than preserve valuable cultural heritage. The class dynamics that characterise Victorian society create social attitudes that view castle preservation as aristocratic nostalgia, irrelevant to democratic progress and middle-class advancement opportunities. You observe how Victorian middle-class culture defines itself partly through rejection of aristocratic privilege and feudal hierarchy, symbolised by castle architecture. The democratic aspirations of Victorian society make castle preservation appear to celebrate social systems that progressive civilization should overcome rather than preserve. The scientific positivism that influences Victorian intellectual culture creates analytical frameworks that value measurable progress over historical continuity, making castle preservation difficult to justify using the empirical criteria that Victorian society applies to policy decisions. You notice how Victorian decision-making emphasises statistical analysis, cost-benefit calculation, and measurable outcomes rather than cultural values that might support preservation activities. The analytical methods that guide Victorian governance prove poorly suited to justifying expenditures for preservation activities that generate no quantifiable benefits. The international competition that drives Victorian development creates national priorities focused on industrial and military superiority rather than historical preservation that might distract resources from modernisation efforts required for international competitiveness. You witness how Victorian governments prioritise railway construction, military modernisation, and industrial development over cultural preservation activities that contribute nothing to national power. The competitive international environment makes castle preservation seem like luxury expenditure that successful nations cannot afford. The transportation revolution that transforms Victorian society makes castle locations less strategically valuable while simultaneously making alternative locations more accessible for development activities that might otherwise utilise castle properties. You observe how railway networks create new geographic advantages that make traditional castle positions irrelevant while providing transportation access to previously remote areas suitable for development. The transportation improvements that characterise Victorian progress reduce both the strategic value and economic necessity of castle locations. The insurance and financing systems that developed during the Victorian era prove poorly adapted to supporting preservation activities for properties that generate no income stream capable of justifying maintenance investments. You notice how Victorian financial institutions focus on productive investments that generate measurable returns rather than preservation activities that consume resources without producing quantifiable benefits. The commercial logic that guides Victorian finance makes castle preservation economically irrational from business perspectives that dominate Victorian decision-making. The legal frameworks that govern property development during the Victorian era prioritise economic utilisation over historical preservation, making castle conversion to industrial uses legally easier than preservation efforts that might restrict development opportunities. You witness how Victorian property law emphasises productive use rights while providing limited protection for historical preservation interests that might conflict with economic development. The legal preference for productive property utilisation makes castle preservation legally complicated, while making industrial conversion legally straightforward. The cultural exports that spread Victorian values throughout Europe and beyond create international influence that extends Victorian attitudes toward castle preservation to regions that might otherwise maintain stronger preservation traditions. You observe how Victorian cultural influence promotes industrial development priorities and progressive social values that reduce international support for medieval heritage preservation. The global reach of Victorian cultural influence accelerates castle neglect throughout regions where Victorian development models become influential. The documentation practices that characterise Victorian administrative systems often ignore castle properties that lack obvious economic or political significance. creating administrative neglect that compounds physical deterioration with bureaucratic indifference. You notice how Victorian record keeping focuses on economically productive properties, while systematically ignoring abandoned castles that contribute nothing to taxation revenues or administrative purposes. This administrative neglect makes castle preservation more difficult by eliminating governmental oversight that might otherwise monitor preservation needs. The municipal development that accompanies Victorian urbanisation often treats castle properties as convenient sites for expanding urban infrastructure rather than heritage treasures that require preservation consideration during city planning processes. You witness how Victorian urban planning prioritises efficient infrastructure development over historical preservation concerns that might complicate municipal expansion projects. The urban development pressure that characterises Victorian growth creates systematic threats to castle properties located near expanding cities. As this Victorian indifference toward castle preservation reaches its peak, you recognise that the industrial age has created cultural attitudes that view medieval heritage as obstacle rather than treasure, making systematic castle neglect inevitable consequence of progress rather than unfortunate accident of history. The great age of industrial achievement proves incapable of appreciating architectural achievements from earlier eras, leaving castle ruins to face their darkest period of neglect during Europe's brightest era of prosperity and technological capability. You arrive in the 21st century to witness an extraordinary transformation as European societies recognise that their medieval castle heritage faces imminent extinction, sparking desperate preservation efforts that race against time to save the fragmentary remains of fortress civilization before they crumble beyond recovery. The year's 2020, and you observe UNESCO officials documenting endangered castle sites while archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar to map foundations buried beneath centuries of vegetation growth. This modern conservation awakening represents humanity's belated recognition that irreplaceable architectural treasures are disappearing forever, creating urgent preservation campaigns that combine cutting-edge technology with traditional craftsmanship in efforts to preserve what remains of Europe's castle legacy. The archaeological discoveries that emerge from modern castle research reveal the extraordinary sophistication of medieval engineering that previous generations failed to appreciate or understand. You witness how LiDAR scanning technology discovers hidden castle features invisible to surface observation, while chemical analysis of ancient mortars reveals construction techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate. These scientific investigations demonstrate that medieval castle builders possessed technical knowledge that surpassed anything available until recent decades, making preservation efforts urgent not only for historical reasons, but for understanding advanced engineering techniques that could inform contemporary construction practices. The climate change threats that affect castle ruins create accelerating deterioration patterns that make immediate preservation intervention essential for preventing total loss of remaining medieval structures. You observe how changing precipitation patterns, temperature extremes, and severe weather events create environmental stresses that exceed the adaptive capacity of ancient building techniques designed for different climate conditions. The environmental challenges that castle ruins now face prove more destructive than anything they experienced during their military lifetimes, making contemporary preservation efforts literally life or death struggles for architectural survival. The digital documentation projects that contemporary preservationists undertake create detailed records of castle structures that may soon exist only in virtual form as physical ruins disappear beyond recovery. You witness how photogrammetry, laser scanning, and drone surveys capture precise three-dimensional records of castle ruins, while they still retain enough structural integrity to provide meaningful architectural information. These digital preservation efforts often represent last opportunities to record architectural details that will disappear within years or decades. making virtual documentation increasingly important as physical preservation proves economically impossible. Historians still argue whether contemporary preservation efforts represent genuine commitment to cultural heritage or guilt-motivated responses to centuries of neglect that attempt to compensate for past failures through dramatic but ultimately inadequate preservation activities. You notice how modern preservation funding often prioritizes highly visible projects that generate publicity over systematic maintenance that might prove more effective for long-term conservation. The political and cultural motivations that drive contemporary preservation efforts sometimes conflict with technical preservation requirements that demand sustained, unglamorous maintenance rather than dramatic rescue operations. The funding challenges that affect castle preservation create competition between conservation needs and contemporary social priorities that make comprehensive preservation politically difficult to justify in democratic societies facing multiple pressing needs. You observe how preservation advocates must compete for public resources with healthcare, education, infrastructure, and environmental protection programs that serve immediate human needs rather than historical heritage interests. The economic competition for limited public resources makes castle preservation vulnerable to budget cuts during economic downturns that affect governmental spending priorities. The technical expertise required for authentic castle restoration proves increasingly scarce as traditional building crafts disappear, along with the structures they were developed to maintain. You witness how finding stonemasons capable of working with medieval construction techniques becomes more difficult each year. While the specialized knowledge needed for authentic restoration dies, along with elderly craftsmen who learned their skills during previous restoration projects, the loss of technical expertise makes castle preservation increasingly expensive and less authentic as contemporary craftsmen attempt to replicate medieval techniques using modern tools and materials. Quirky modern preservation approaches reveal creative attempts to save castle ruins through methods that medieval builders could never have imagined. Some preservation projects use chemical stabilizers that strengthen deteriorating stone without altering its appearance, while others employ structural engineering techniques that provide invisible internal support for walls that appear unchanged from exterior observation. The most innovative approaches involve computer modeling that enables preservation teams to predict structural failure patterns and intervene before collapse occurs, preventing emergency situations that might require more invasive preservation treatments. The tourism industry that develops around preserved castle sites creates both opportunities and threats for conservation efforts, as visitor revenues can fund preservation activities, while visitor impacts accelerate structural deterioration. You observe how managing tourism access requires balancing preservation needs with economic requirements that make tourism revenue essential for funding conservation activities. The tourism pressure that generates preservation funding simultaneously creates wear patterns, pollution exposure, and structural stresses that can accelerate castle deterioration beyond levels that tourism revenues can address. The international cooperation that characterizes contemporary castle preservation creates knowledge-sharing networks that enable preservation specialists to learn from successful projects while avoiding techniques that prove ineffective or damaging. You witness how preservation professionals collaborate across national boundaries to develop best practices for castle conservation, while adapting general principles to address specific conditions affecting individual sites. This international cooperation represents unprecedented collaboration in preservation activities that transcends political boundaries that historically limited conservation knowledge sharing. The legal frameworks that contemporary societies develop for heritage protection create regulatory systems that can mandate castle preservation, while providing funding mechanisms that enable conservation activities despite private ownership complications. You notice how heritage protection laws often override private property rights to require preservation activities, while simultaneously providing governmental support for conservation costs that private owners cannot afford. These legal innovations represent new approaches to balancing private property rights with public heritage interests that previous legal systems could not accommodate. The educational programs that accompany contemporary preservation efforts create public awareness about castle heritage that previous generations lacked, while developing professional expertise needed for continuing conservation activities. You observe how preservation education combines historical knowledge, technical training, and public outreach to create sustainable preservation capacity that can continue beyond current preservation crises. The educational dimension of preservation efforts represents long-term investment in conservation capabilities that may prove more important than immediate preservation activities. The corporate involvement that characterizes some contemporary castle preservation projects creates private funding sources that supplement governmental resources while potentially creating commercial interests that conflict with preservation priorities. You witness how corporate sponsorship can provide essential funding for preservation projects while creating marketing opportunities that may compromise authentic preservation approaches. The corporate dimension of preservation funding represents both opportunity and challenge for conservation efforts that require sustained financial support beyond governmental capabilities. Do you remember the journey we began together, standing among the stone giants at their moment of greatest power? You have witnessed the long decline from that golden age of castle civilization through warfare, economic pressure, political transformation, and cultural change that gradually emptied the great fortresses of their purpose and their people. The military revolution that made castle walls obsolete, the economic burden that made maintenance impossible, the political centralization that made fortress ownership dangerous, the architectural fashion that made castle living uncomfortable. All these forces combined to transform symbols of permanence into monuments to the passage of time. The religious reformation that scattered monastic communities, the agricultural revolution that drew rural populations elsewhere, the transportation networks that bypassed traditional routes, the urban migration that concentrated wealth in commercial cities. These demographic and economic changes eliminated the human communities that castle civilization required for survival. Natural disasters, stone quarrying, legal disputes, and romantic appreciation for ruins accelerated the transformation from living fortresses to picturesque decay that Victorian indifference allowed to proceed without intervention. Now, in our contemporary moment, you witness the final chapter of this thousand-year story as modern preservation efforts race against time to save fragmentary remains of a lost civilization. The irony proves profound. The technical capabilities needed to preserve castles properly have arrived precisely when most castle heritage has already disappeared beyond recovery. The archaeological techniques that could reveal castle secrets, the engineering methods that could stabilize ancient walls, the material science that could extend structural lifespans. All these preservation capabilities emerged too late to save the vast majority of European castles that have already crumbled into memory. Yet perhaps there is hope in this awakening. The preservation efforts you observe, though late and limited, represent humanity's recognition that some achievements transcend the immediate circumstances that created them. The castle ruins that survive into our era carry messages across centuries, not just about military engineering or political power, but about human ambition to create something permanent in an impermanent world. Each preserved wall fragment, each documented foundation, each digital reconstruction represents a conversation between past and present that enriches both eras through mutual understanding. The children who visit preserved castle sites today may never experience the drafty discomfort of medieval fortress living, but they encounter something equally valuable: the physical evidence of human creativity, engineering skill, and artistic vision that transcends the political circumstances that originally motivated castle construction. The educational programs that contemporary preservation efforts create transform castle ruins from symbols of vanished feudalism into laboratories for understanding human creativity that spans centuries and cultures. The international collaboration that characterizes modern preservation efforts creates global communities of scholars, craftsmen, and conservationists who share knowledge across political boundaries that medieval castle builders could never have imagined crossing. The techniques developed for preserving European castles now inform conservation projects worldwide. While preservation challenges in other cultures contribute to European castle conservation efforts, this global preservation community represents a form of human collaboration that medieval fortress builders would have found remarkable. The technologies that enable contemporary preservation efforts demonstrate how human knowledge accumulates across generations in ways that can benefit heritage that predates the technologies by centuries. The laser scanning that records castle dimensions, the chemical analysis that reveals construction techniques, the computer modelling that predicts structural behaviour, these modern tools serve medieval architecture in ways that create dialogues between different eras of human achievement. The funding challenges that contemporary preservation faces reflect broader questions about how societies allocate resources between present needs and heritage preservation that affects future generations. The debate over preservation spending represents democratic society grappling with fundamental questions about intergenerational responsibility and cultural continuity that go far beyond castle conservation to encompass civilization's approach to preserving achievements from previous eras. As you stand among the ruins that survive into our contemporary moment, you recognize that the story of castle decline and modern preservation efforts illuminates fundamental aspects of human civilization that transcend medieval fortifications, the creative ambition that built castles, the economic forces that made them unsustainable, the cultural changes that transformed their meaning, the preservation efforts that attempt to save fragmentary remains. These patterns repeat throughout human history as civilizations create, abandon, and rediscover their heritage. The castle ruins of modern Europe represent more than failed fortifications or successful preservation projects. They embody humanity's complex relationship with time, permanence, and cultural continuity that affects every generation's decisions about what to preserve, what to abandon, and what to transform. The lessons learned from castle decline and preservation efforts inform contemporary decisions about preserving other cultural achievements that future generations may value differently than present societies. The peaceful contemplation that castle ruins now offer contrasts dramatically with their original military purpose. Yet this transformation illustrates how human achievements can acquire meanings that transcend their original functions. The fortifications built for warfare now serve education, tourism, and cultural identity in ways that their builders could never have anticipated. This functional transformation suggests that preservation efforts serve purposes beyond maintaining physical structures to encompass preserving human creativity that can inspire and educate future generations. The morning light that now filters through broken castle windows illuminates stones that have witnessed centuries of human drama.